Hey, 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 everyone. We are back. And as I recall, the plan today was to watch some actual competitive debates so we can see what that looks like as opposed to just hearing about it so you can get a gauge of what that is. I, as always, have some tea. Today it's chamomile tea, a top tier tea. I love chamomile. It does make me feel a little weird to talk about it though because America's like the only place that calls it chamomile. Everywhere, most of the world, it's chamikilometer. Um, Goodbye, subscribers. I'll miss you. uh, but no, yeah. I'll give people a little bit of a chance to file in. I know we just got started, so I don't want to like dive straight into it. Maybe what we'll do first, let's take a look and see if I can't find at least an interesting resolution. Oh my God, my chair is like stuck exactly the distance I don't want it to be from my computer. Okay. So let's take a look. I'll give you. I know we had a few set aside. Okay, so 2004 is a while ago, but that was also my sophomore year, so I'm a little bit interested in that one. I think I want to start with a topic I've discussed prior, see if it jogs the old memory. Trip down memory lane for me. But we won't keep to those necessarily. Oh, there's one from last year also. I wonder if it says in the description. Oh, okay, here we have the resolve. Civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. Oh, I remember this one. I don't remember what my cases looked like at the time, but I do remember this topic. So one thing we haven't really talked about is what different resolutions or different topics, as people tend to call it conversationally, look like in competitive debate. It varies based on the kind of debate and what they're trying to go for. I don't know why it's formatted like this, but the way you can basically read this is um, the affirmative, that is the proponents, the side that's trying to prove their case, the one that speaks first and last. Uh, they are trying to prove this is correct. And now you'll notice it's already, there's already some tendencies that you see here that it is a moral statement, right? We're talking about it being morally justified. Doesn't matter what the law says, whether it's morally justified. And we're talking about often a lot of really vague terms. So, you'll have to explain what you mean by these things. So I guess we'll start with what I think about this, right? We try at the outset of every debate to be clear about what my position is as much as I can be. I know when we discuss the veganism subject, I was still figuring out what my thoughts were, still working them out. So I'm not going to claim that I'm always going to have a very complete and like strong position on everything, and that's okay. We can learn when we watch stuff. That's good. But I do want to say from the outset what I think about this resolution. First of all, I don't think being in a democracy matters at all. I think if we'll come back to this, but the first thing that jumps out at me is that if civil disobedience is justified morally, I don't think it matters. Like, are you going to say it's moral in a democracy but not moral in a monarchy? Why? Um, it's a little weird here. I think it's only there because uh, we live in a liberal democracy, and I don't know. It feels important to liberals that we're talking about democracy, but like in a lot of ways, it really doesn't. Now, civil disobedience. This is generally people what people generally mean by civil disobedience is things like being disruptive in a way that's not overtly violent. So this would be like peaceful protest or a sit-in or for Rosa Parks refusing to move from her seat at the front of the bus. These are things where you are not, in fact, causing anyone any harm other than possibly inconvenience, but you are noting your discontent. Another more recent example, though still decently a few years ago, was taking a knee during the national anthem that a lot of NFL players were doing in particular. Blanking on his name. What was his name? The name Kavanaugh keeps coming in my hand, but that's not right. I forget his name. Chat if you fill that in. But this would be an instance of you're not really causing harm, but you are demonstrating your dissent. That's my understanding of it. Now let's back that up um with what a dictionary might say about this. And this is what you would do in a competitive if when preparing for competitive date is you'll look at different definitions that you can find for it. I feel, and we'll see how much it comes up, but one of the ways that I felt competitive debate was really lacking, and I didn't realize this until the end, is that the definition portion is kind of hand waved as much as it should be relevant to the discussion. I found that it generally was under discussed, and usually it was just, cite a dictionary, here's my definition. But honestly, it shouldn't matter what dictionary it comes from, or even if it comes from a dictionary. You should be defining your term, and if people have a disagreement with it, we can argue about that. And often, the only real disagreement that people have on an argument is with definitions. And I don't remember which debate we've already covered where that came up, but I know that comes up. I know we've talked about this before. Sometimes the only contention is what we mean by these terms, and I feel often even in competitive debate, maybe even especially in competitive debate, it's just kind of moved past. You just like, oh, well, Black's Law Dictionary says this, and then we move on and we never talk about it again. And I understand that, right? You want to get into the arguments. That's the fun stuff. You want to get into the logical arguments. Oh, Higley. You want to get into the reasons why things are not the case, but it's really important to delve into what the different definitions are. So let's like really delve into this. I was hoping that would take me to the actual dictionary.com page. All right, the refusal to comply with certain laws or pay taxes and fines as a peaceful form of political protest. Yeah, so basically, as I said, let's see if Stanford's University Dictionary of Philosophy has a they have a very detailed. Oh my. Whoo boy, this is a big definition. As you can see, there's a lot of discussion about this, and this is kind of why I didn't want to stop at a mere one or two sentence definition. Uh, let's just glance over the features of civil disobedience here. Henry David Thoreau is widely credited for coining the term civil disobedience. That's not relevant here. Okay, so for years, Thoreau refused to pay state poll taxes as a protest against an institution of slavery, the extermination of Native Americans, and the war against Mexico. The um this is completely off topic, but the issue I do take with this is that this is a very quiet form of protest, and protest should be trying to shine a light on the injustices being done. These injustices are very definitely worth protesting. I'm like fully on board with opposition to them. I guess I don't know enough about the war against Mexico to know but it was probably not great. But the first two absolutely right. Like okay, good. I'm glad you're protesting. I just wish it was louder. I wish it was something more bombastic, even if still within the bounds of what you would call civil disobedience, because these are really important issues. But that's kind of off topic. When a Concord, Massachusetts constable named Sam Saylor asked Thoreau to pay his back taxes in 1846 and Thoreau refused, Staples escorted him to jail. In a public lecture that Thoreau gave twice in 1848, he justified the tax refusals way to withdraw cooperation with the government, and he called on his fellow townspeople to do the same. Okay, so like where it starts to be better. As political action is now you have a lot of people not paying their taxes over this issue. That I wonder if this would be a a good tactic for protest now. I don't know, but at least now you have a lot of people, and it's hitting them in the wallet, right where it hurts. Thoreau's lecture titled "The Rights and Duties of Individual in Relation to Government" formed the basis of his 1849 essay "Resistance to Civil Government." Okay, this is more just a history, but I just want. Okay. First, for an act to be civilly disobedient, it must involve some breach of the law. In democratic society, civil disobedience as such is not a crime. Uh, what? Isn't that contradictory? You are in breach of the law. Is that not? Uh, oh, maybe that's why the resolution says in a democracy, because you're not actually. It's not a crime. Ooh, I don't love that. But we would get off this subject too much if we were to delve into it. I'll just say the short version is that liberals, and I mean like big L liberals, are really opposed to like, oh, you should never, like, it's always wrong to do a crime. So if this was a crime, we shouldn't do this. civil disobedience, but because in a democracy it's not a crime, it's okay. But it would be a crime in a feudal state. Maybe they would take issue with it. Again, very off topic, but that's the thing that's in my head as I'm reviewing this. When an agent who engages in civil disobedience is punished by the law, it is not for civil disobedience, but for the recognized offenses she commits, such as disturbing the peace, trespassing, damaging property. Wait. Oh, okay. It's okay. I don't know why we're splitting this here. Okay, this is very stupid. But yeah, the point is you are breaking the law in some minor way that shows your discontent. Um, I don't know where they draw. Okay, I mean, this is a long essay, so I'm sure they get into the more of the details, but I'm not gonna go read that giant description. Oh, give me 1 second. I forgot to turn on my fan. It's quite warm these days, and having not having it would be a bit of an issue. Okay. And then last we'll check Merriam-Webster. I do want to give you. I do want to do this, even though it feels like a digression, because looking at, as I said, looking at different definitions is something competitive debaters ought to be doing, and it's often useful for seeing how people talk about these ideas. This is more relevant when you talk about ideas that are much less defined, something like justice. What do we mean by justice? But it's something you should do for a lot of these terms. Okay, well, this is an example. Refusal to obey governmental demands or commands, especially as a non-violent and usual collective means of forcing concessions from the government. Honestly, this just feels like protest that escalates to like breaking minor laws, is the sense I get. But if protest weren't a legally guaranteed right, then protest would even follow under this. And for what it's worth, in the United States, it is less guaranteed than a lot might think. You often need a permit to protest, which seems weird. And what if your permit gets declined? Do you really have the right to protest? I'm not going to get into that too much, but it seems like minor violations of the law in an effort to protest is a reasonable conceptualization of that. Now, a competitive debater shouldn't say something that is expected to not say something that broad, and usually expected to cite a dictionary for this definition. But this is where I feel there's a kind of a failure of form in that you would have a better philosophical debate if you were talking about what we mean generally by these things, and we can discuss what these words ought to mean and how they're actually used, as opposed to just, well, this dictionary said it, and not really having tools to argue why one definition is better than another. That definitely is an issue. And then is morally justified. What do we mean by morally justified? I'm going to leave this for now, and I'm going to let the debaters try to define it themselves. This is where often Lincoln Douglas debate sets out to bite off more than it can chew. How in the hell are you going to establish what system of morality is appropriate and justify it and make a case? You really, in just the short amount of time you have, you really can't. So there's a lot of assumptions built into this of like, well, a lot of the assumptions are just like I said, like liberalism is just kind of treated as a default. But what if someone said, they're a con, and sometimes people will say like, oh, I'm a con, I'll go by Kant's categorical imperative or whatever else, but you can't like argue the details of it. So we'll see what they say about it. And now that I've like jawed on for a little bit, I guess now what is my thought on this? Yeah, I think civil disobedience is very much morally justified but not in itself. It is morally justified if what you are endeavoring to protest, like whatever your protest position is morally justified. So if you were opposed to the institution of slavery as Thoreau was, then yes, your civil disobedience I think would be justified. But if someone today is protesting and saying that we should bring back slavery, I think their civil disobedience would be unjustified, because it's not the disobedience itself that is the characteristic I'm judging the morality on. It's basically what you're trying to accomplish, and your ends, if you are in favor of slavery, are evil, and they should not be enacted. Now, the civil disobedience is kind of neutral in that way, and I think that civil disobedience is, in fact, morally neutral because, in general, you're not really causing that much harm. Now, even in the cases where you are, it's whether that harm is justified. So, if you're protesting in favor of slavery, then that harm is very not justified. You are causing small amounts of harm in order to so that you may cause an enormous amount of harm. Every step of this is bad. But if you are protesting change the subject to something else Thoreau was protesting against, to the genocide of the Native Americans, and you're saying, hey, we should maybe not be doing that, then the small amount of harm is pales in comparison to how much harm you're trying to prevent. And so I don't think this is a good question to ask, honestly. And you might ask yourself, okay, well, in competitive debate, can you even say that? Well, yeah, you can actually. There is a concept that we're unlikely to see here, but it's called a critique, also known as a K, because that's not how that's spelled. But anyway, where you can critique the resolution, and it's usually the negative doing that is like we should reject this resolution because it doesn't make sense to ask this question. And if I were going to debate this now and try to be honest to myself in what I believe, I would, on the negative, make probably write a critique that this resolution doesn't work because the actual disobedience isn't the issue at hand. It's about what you're. It has to be justified or not justified based on your ends. And then if I were on the affirmative, I might make the argument that we that we should assume that it is being used towards a positive end and not a negative one, and that you can sometimes make arguments that the writers of the resolution assumed it that way. But that said, moral civil disobedience in itself is not really good or bad in and of itself because you have to acknowledge that there is some amount of harm being done. I'm okay with that harm being done for good ends, and I'm not okay with it being done for bad ends. So there's nothing. I suppose you could argue that it is a slight moral harm, a moral negative, to engage in the civil disobedience because you're causing this tiny amount of harm. But almost anything you could be using it for is going to be far more relevant as to its moral justification. I suppose you could argue if you were protesting, like the price of stamps went up 2 cents, and so I'm going to do a sit-in in the post office. It is a very minor amount of harm for a very minor change that you're protesting, and like maybe it's a minor good in the world to reduce the cost of stamps. Maybe you could argue then that like there's a little bit of wiggle room of like, well, I don't know, is it worth it? But that's not usually what people are going to be referring to, and even in my discussing this, there's a bit of that assumption in the background that you're using it for something more significant than that. These are a lot of nuances that, unfortunately, the competitive debate just there's too little time to really get into. As weird as that might seem, because it's set out to, you have like 40 minutes to talk about this, but the thing is, you have to front load everything. Everything that you want to talk about has to exist in your speech the first time, or it can only be a counter argument from that point, which sometimes you can introduce new stuff, but for the most part, you can't really get into a lot of these nuances. It's just kind of a failure of time. But the point, of course, is not to get fully into the nuances. It is to get these are high school students to start thinking about things in these ways. Ask them questions that they might not have wrestled with before. Get them to investigate the details and the nuance in their research, and then unfortunately get them to argue both sides of it regardless of what conclusion they come to, which isn't necessarily like it can help you in theory it should help you reason out which position you have, but in practice I tended to find that was not really the case. I tried to do as a little bit with saying like, okay, how would I write these cases if I were still debating today? And I think there are ways where you can kind of uh, in the two examples I gave of what my arguments would be for each side, I was still on board with my sense of my answer to this question of how I really feel about it. But even talking about the affirmative, I felt like I was being a little a little dishonest in that I felt it was a bad question to ask. But if we can assume, I guess maybe the way I'd phrase it, it's a bad question to ask, but if we assume that we're talking about um, positive ends, then it's good. But then it's kind of a tautology, right? If it's justified, then it's justified. These are my thoughts ahead of time, but I want to focus more on what the debaters are saying. I'll let you in a little bit on my plans for talking about competitive debate because I think we should watch several of these and I want to change our outlook on each one. For this one, I'm going to try as much as possible to review these debates like I have been the other debates and then slowly lead into how to review it like a debater to the point where I might actually, when we get to some subsequent debate reviews, I probably won't talk over the speakers at all and start taking notes and flowing the way I should be doing. It's going to be a little difficult because I've never been fast enough at typing to do that, and like formatting would be a little tough. But figuring out how to write with that, I mean, I'll be looking down all the time. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. For now, we're just going to review this debate, and with these thoughts on the subject ahead of time, because obviously you should acknowledge your own bias. And if people in the chat have any ideas about this that they want to share, I would be exceptionally happy. I would be ecstatic for you to share those share them with the class. But to put them in the chat and let me know if you think there's anything I missed or any thoughts you have about it that I might not have already discussed, because I'm sure people have opinions on these. One of the things I liked about a lot of these resolutions, at least during my time, is a lot of them were things that people would discuss. This is a topic that's not it's not too esoteric for people to have encountered. So all that out of the way, let's watch what is undoubtedly going to be a horrible audio-visual experience, but hopefully a very interesting intellectual one.
I would like to introduce to you the two debaters you will be listening.
If this is too bad, just let me know. We'll watch something else. Oof, that hit me hard. All these trophies behind her. Oh, I am kind of curious where this is taking place. So this is the 2004 NFL Nationals. I think I mentioned before I was in the NFL, National Forensics League, and it's Oh, well, did they spoil the ending? All right, I'm gonna move past that. But Harvard Westlake is the coach. Um, is it the person who wins, who I won't give away. I'll in case you didn't read it, I won't spoil it additionally. The person who coached the winner apparently now coaches at Harvard Westlake, which I want to say is the school that had that debate class where a lot of them just didn't really care, but it might have been a different school that I've definitely encountered when I did debate.
To this afternoon, on the affirmative, you will be hearing code 276. 276.
And outside
on the negative, you.
Oh God, that audio. Normally in a debate round, it's not. You don't have all this flair. You don't have a moderator who's like announcing everything. Often it's just in a classroom. There's not very frequently not a podium. More often, sometimes you'll have a lectern. It was usually just a classroom. Sometimes you're sitting in those like, the desk seats that are put together like you'd see in a high school class. It's not often like this, but obviously for the Nationals, they're gonna put it on a big stage and give all the flair and attention and whatnot.
You will be hearing 181, code 181.
I don't know what these codes are.
Good luck,
it's probably
debaters.
something relevant for the like. Okay, we have a huge national tournament where all these students are participating. There is also a cultural thing where the affirmative sits on if you're facing the stage on the left side and the negative sits on the at least maybe I'm getting it mixed up, but there's like a side.
Before I begin, I would just like to thank Scott Wan in the National Forensics League, Lincoln Financial, and Schwann's Foods.
The giving things is not typical either,
this week,
but
as well as the
Salt
Salt Lake City School District and the Church of Latter-day Saints for allowing us use of their facilities.
Oh, okay.
I would also like to personally thank those who have helped me immensely over the past 4 years,
I'll just let him go.
Mazen Spady and Victor G. My coaches Mike Beats and Wiegand and Jess Bailey, Edina High School, Lynn and Joe Schmidt, and finally my teammates Nick Green and John McNeil.
This is, like I said, not typical, but you're at nationals. It's pretty expected, I guess.
I submit that if an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him or her is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, that individual is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. It's because I agree with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. I affirm the resolution that civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified.
So this is a tendency that I haven't spoken about yet because it was broken of me. I was broken of it before I had the opportunity to learn it was a thing. Opening quotes are very, very common in Lincoln Douglas debate. I agree with the sentiment that they are pointless except for the possibility of virtue signaling. It's just like, he said this, but you're not really justifying anything. You're more implying that you're right, um, without, like in this case it's closer to the subject of the resolution than generally, but even still it's not an argument. It's merely to preface by like some other smart guy agreed with me. As I say, I was broken of this before I even started. The first year I did debate, I don't know if this is, I think this is pretty consistent. Oh, I guess it was a little different. So in the first year I did debate, the coach wanted us to get into the actual arguing before we had to figure out how to make a case, which is understandable. You want us to know why a case should look like why it does before asking us to write it. So for the freshmen, or I guess I should just say for the novices, he would write the cases. Well, because the previous year, the graduating class that graduated right before I started, what had a lot of very, very good debaters on it. They kind of had a reputation for going to a bunch of tournaments and winning. Uh, the first case the first negative case I ever got was written by one of them actually, instead of my coach. My affirmative case was written by my coach, the negative case was written by them. And I got to understand the whole thing about opening quotes from the first thing I read in that in that case, which was, if I think I can remember it exactly, because opening quotes mean absolutely nothing. I'll start with some words from John Handy. When he says, quote, "I think if you're robbing a bank and your pants fall down, I think it's okay to laugh and let your hostages laugh too, because come on, life is funny." And the point is like, what we're not really saying anything with these. And let me see if I can find that. Let me see if I can actually find. Let's see if I can find that quote. But um, yeah, here it is. "If you're robbing a bank and your pants fall down, I think it's okay to laugh and let your hostages laugh too, because come on, life is funny." It's so the point is that quote is as relevant as the MLK quote as far as the actual argumentation. Now I understand that that MLK had good reasons for that statement, and I agree with the sentiment. But you're not making an argument, and if you wanted to make an argument from that, you should put that in the bulk of your case, in your contentions. This is more of a rhetorical flair, kind of like when you write an essay where you want to start with something that grabs the audience. It's not bad to be rhetorically effective, but it's not good argumentation. I'm not going to fault this debater for it. It's ubiquitous across all of debate, and it was pretty rare for people to not have opening quotes unless they specifically, got told about this and like ended up agreeing about it. But if you never hear otherwise, most people have opening quotes.
I have one definition. According to Professor Michael Walzer,
Just one
in his book
definition. So this is what I mean about definitions being under discussed. He has one thing he feels he needs to define, which I think there are at minimum 3 terms in the resolution, right? Civil disobedience should be defined. Morally justified. What we mean, you won't have like a definition, but you should generally have an idea of what you mean by that. You should even what justified means. You might want to define that in some way. And democracy, I don't think is necessary, but you might want to throw in a definition for that. Just send a sentence or two on it. And then the second thing is, notice he is like this guy who's important reference a thing. This was another issue I started to have is there was a lot of appeals to authority and like, well, because this person said it, it's true. But a lot of people make mistakes, and it's the important thing should be the reasons behind these ideas. And if someone doesn't quote anyone important but has really well thought out reasons that they can justify on their own, I think that should be taken as legitimate and just as legitimate as quoting a philosopher. This was another kind of crusade I went on during my time as a debater, and I won't say how I won't I don't know I don't think I was particularly I don't know how convincing I was to other people, but that was at the very least my stance on it, and I still agree with that now. And but you should expect to see a lot of these. Well, this authority said it, and so we're already seeing it with a definition.
Obligations. Civil disobedience is a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, in which a person breaks the law but does so in ways which do not challenge the legitimacy of the legal or political system.
I realize he's not done because he just started to speak. I mostly agree with this. The one thing I don't really like is an encounter with the law. Getting arrested for like jaywalking is not civil disobedience if you don't do it with the intention of getting arrested for right. There's a little bit of intentionality that's relevant. If you get a speeding ticket, that's not necessarily civil disobedience, but it is a non-revolution encounter with the state. Which hold on,
which do not
challenge the legitimacy of the law, which is also something that I think liberals, and again I mean like big L liberals here, would be a big fan of like not of still agreeing with the legitimacy of the state. It's always really important that the state be legitimate, and you can't and like revolutionary action that should be opposed by implication. He hasn't said this, and the resolution doesn't really talk about that, but you shouldn't be delegitimizing the law. You still say, yeah, I'm breaking the law, but you still have the authority, and I agree with that. This is a very very liberal way of looking at the world, and I less and less agree with over time. We won't get into that too much because it's off the subject, but I just wanted to notice that as much as these debates pretend to be apolitical, there is politics running all through it. It's just the assumption that these ideas are apolitical and that they don't need justification. That is, just the way things are and should be.
Political system. This person feels morally bound to disobey, but also recognizes the moral value of the state. Civil disobedience is a way of maneuvering between these conflicting moralities. Disobedience willingly accepts punishment, which is a key distinguishing factor between disobedience and other forms of crime like vandalism.
I like that distinction. I think, and I agree that a distinction between civil disobedience and other forms of protest or crime is that you don't argue. You accept the punishments even if you think they shouldn't have been happening. This is how people like Martin Luther King end up in jail, right? Is through knowingly breaking the law as an act of protest, but not fighting with your imprisonment for this. Now, whether that's inherently good to do, I'm not really sure, but I do agree with like that seems to capture the idea of civil disobedience more thoroughly than without that caveat.
Which are intended to remain anonymous. The highest value for this debate is morality, since the resolution...
Okay, so he's putting it in slightly different terms, but this is his primary value, morality. This is the thing I care about. I don't like the use of morality as your primary value, because what the fuck does that mean? And often this means, in a very liberal sense, like liberal morality, but people often have disagreements on what this means, and to say a primary value is morality is kind of to not have a primary value, is because the value you're saying, your primary value should be a thing you think is moral. If I say, if my primary value is freedom, for example, I'm saying I think that's a good thing. That's why I value it. It is morally good, and especially because we're always in a Lincoln Douglas debate talking about moral concerns, or I guess generally you're talking about moral concerns. You're saying it is a moral good to have this primary value. So to say it's a moral good to have morality, it's nonsense. It's tautological. But you're not going to see. I don't expect that he'll get rebuffed on this, because this is kind of the culture of this kind of debate. Like, liberalism is kind of suffused throughout and assumed as true, especially in 2004. I don't know if it's changed. I shouldn't say especially in 2004, because I also know after a friend of mine is, I don't know if he still is, but at least for a while was a debate coach, and he was telling me about like how things have changed, and it seems like it was even more the case in like the mid teens, like 2016, 2017, something like that. It seemed to be even more the case than back then, but I don't know if it's changed since then, is what I mean to say. But you shouldn't expect pushback on something like this. The like background of like, we all have the same we all agree on the same set of morals is kind of there, even though it's not true.
Resolution questions whether civil disobedience can be justified on moral grounds. Democracies trust individuals to make moral decisions, so the criterion for morality is individual conscience.
Okay, so this is where we have a value criterion. Now, I was taught by a coach I trusted a lot and seemed to be a very good coach. The value criterion should be some sort of thing you do. So it would be like maximizing human creativity or whatever the thing is. But that's fine. This is something that as far as I was taught, should also be both necessary and sufficient for your primary value, at the very least in this case. If in this consideration we if we uphold the value criterion, then we will have achieved what we value, in this case morality. I'm going to go back and make sure I remember what his value criterion was. So
trust individuals to make moral decisions, so the criterion for morality is individual conscience.
So individual conscience. Yeah, I really don't like this. I'm actually surprised that this is what we're seeing in the finals. I never debated at this level, but this is kind of wild. It's such a nebulous term, and its connection to morality is inherently tenuous, right? People's individual conscience, unless you believe some pretty religious things, like that people all have morality given by God and it's all the same and we know when we're being moral, which only some religious people believe, even, let alone non-religious people, and what religions on top of that. Unless you believe something like that, more like individual conscience is by no means related to morality in any intrinsic way. I mean, it's some people's individual conscience that like slavery was okay, or that the Holocaust was a thing that should happen. But no, they were wrong. They've like in both cases, for both terms, for individual conscience and what we mean by morality, like it's kind of nebulous, but like from at least where I'm standing, they're clearly wrong. But you'd have to like make, what do we even mean by morality? If they could be right because of their individual conscience, what are we even appealing to? But if we're appealing to anything specific, they must be wrong. It's just one of those, like, one of those two things must be the case. I hope I explained that clearly. But this is, I'm already not a fan of this, but we'll see.
As political philosopher John Rawls writes in A Theory of Justice, even though people normally seek advice and counsel and accept the injunctions of those in authority when these seem reasonable to them, they are always accountable for their deed. We cannot divest ourselves of our responsibility and transfer the burden of blame to others. My first contention is that...
So, that I think was intended to justify the connection between his value criterion and his value, and I only say I think because he didn't give us any analysis. He didn't explain why that connection is there. And while I agree that liberal philosophers will generally believe that, individual rights and actions are the grounds for like morality or whatever, or whatever, I blanked a little bit on what he was talking about, but like I don't think that is sufficient to make his argument. But now we're getting into the contentions. Here are the arguments. I wonder if he was so brief in the outset because he has a lot of stuff to go over in the argumentation. Also, something you have to consider when you present and when you're writing your case is, how fast what your speaking style is like. He doesn't speak terribly quickly, which I appreciate, by the way. I think people speak altogether too quickly in debate sometimes. I think he's speaking slower than he could get away with, or not even get away with. I think if he spoke a little bit faster, it wouldn't be a detriment. But he shouldn't make himself do that either. If this is the way he speaks, then he should account for that. And rest assured, he has practiced this a lot of times to make sure that he doesn't stumble over his words or say ums. Notice his speech has been his speaking has been very fluid, even if it doesn't feel super naturalistic or like he's particularly charismatic, depending on your opinions on that. He hasn't stumbled. He hasn't said he's kept pace, and if this is his pace, I assure you, he has practiced this many, many, many times to make sure he can do it. He can do it in cleanly, and that it's within the time that he has set out. So uh, that might be part of why we didn't invest too much in the first portion of the debate. I consider it kind of like the header of the debate. You know, the definitions, primary value, value criterion. He didn't go too much into detail with that, but that might be because he has enough to say later, and he knows how long he takes to say it.
That what is legal is not what is moral.
Okay, so what is
Laws
legal is
can
not
and
what
have
is
been
moral.
grossly immoral throughout history.
I agree with
Best
that, for
illustrated
sure.
with the help of the 1927 Supreme Court decision, Buck versus Bell. The state of Virginia was attempting to forcibly sterilize Mrs. Carrie Bell, an institutionalized inmate in a state facility. Mrs. Bell sued.
So now he's giving an example of what he's talking
On
about.
an 8-1 decision, the court struck down the legal challenge. The majority opinion read, quote, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough."
So I think this would have been stronger if he just laid out, instead of giving a story, if he laid out an example of an unjust law. And there are many that you could point to. I mean, like the Fugitive Slave Act is a very clear instance of an unjust law, and just because it's moral doesn't mean it's right. And by the way, this is another instance of like liberal thinking is kind of coursing through the veins of this entire experience. You wouldn't have to say that in a lot of cases. Like imagine in feudal times trying to argue, saying like, "Oh, what is legal isn't necessarily right." Yeah, no shit. Like the lords just do whatever the hell they want. But you know, with like with liberalism as like a kind of background element, there is an assumption that what is legal is moral. At the very least, modern governments tend to try to like law is intended to be a codification of morality. I guess that's not even necessarily modern, but breaking from that is really important. Of like there might be failures in that, and I think it's good to start here. It's one of those like the structure of debate is a little difficult because while this contention on its own doesn't really prove his point, it is necessary in order to proceed from here. Maybe this would have been appropriate as an overview. I'm not really sure, but it's really important that he makes this argument, and it's smart to start here because you have to establish that it is insufficient to just say it is illegal, and so you have to make an argument on moral grounds, and that's where he should be advantaged, generally speaking, unless of course his opponent has a K, but we'll get to that.
Denying the legitimacy of civil disobedience would mean not only that Mrs. Bell would be unjustified in attempting to resist this most inhumane of procedures.
Oh yeah, and now he's saying like you would have to say that this is unjustified. Okay, what if they were comfortable with saying that? You haven't given a reason why it is justified. You just like spoken to the discomfort in saying that she would be unjustified. Okay, what if I'm uncomfortable? It doesn't mean anything. This is pretty bad argumentation, but it is good rhetoric, which this is the distinction, right? Are we trying to win or are we trying to make good arguments? I'm appraising it on an argumentative level. Maybe he wins, and if he does, then well, I guess it was good argumentation for winning. But yeah, not from like a philosophical level. It's not.
Simply perform his duty and would in fact be remiss if he objected on principle. John Rawls, previously cited, agrees that in a democracy, law is not the ultimate moral arbiter. If the sovereign is held to govern by divine right as God's chosen lieutenant,
this is where
and
he
his
should be saying
subjects have only the
why
rights of suppliants,
law isn't
they can plead their cause, but they cannot disobey
arbiter.
should their appeal be denied. To do this would be to rebel against the final legitimate moral and not simply legal authority. But once society is interpreted as a scheme of cooperation among equals, those injured by serious injustices need not submit. By resisting injustice within the limits of fidelity to law, civil disobedience serves to inhibit departures from justice and correct them when they do occur.
Oh, it's unfortunate too. This is completely off topic. I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I wonder if I could find my old debate cases, even if I have to like, go dig up computers that have been sitting in the garage for years. But then I realized, no, at this time, I don't think I had access to a computer, so all my cases were handwritten. So it'd be like, there's almost no chance that I'm almost certain I threw it away, which is kind of unfortunate now. But I mean, I couldn't imagine that 15 years later, more than that, I'd be I'd be interested in going back over it. So it's like a minor loss, but otherwise, I couldn't tell you because I was wondering what my arguments were on this, and I don't know what they were. I don't remember.
Second contention is that civil disobedience
Okay, so the first contention was like fine. I think it's something that's like generally uncontroversial, but if someone wanted to push back against it, his arguments were really weak, right? He didn't tell us why. The closest we got to finding out why law isn't synonymous with morality is because it's no longer divinely inspired. It is now a collaboration between equals. But someone could very easily say, okay, but that collaboration between equals endeavored to codify morality, and so once they have done so, it is an agreement. Especially if we assume the consent of the governed, it is agreement of the governed and the government that this is what morality is. And there's no like discussion of morality changing or even what we mean by morality, even like even vaguely, but or even in specific terms that relate to what we're talking about. So like the argument wasn't made well, but he did mention, but like the argument was an important idea.
functions as a reciprocal check against society.
And I know, I'm picking on high school kids. I'm not trying to impugn them. Like, this is much better than most people can do in adulthood. I'm not saying that like they're, yeah, like no one's pushing back in chat or anything. I just got that twinge. Like, I'm not saying these teenagers are like garbage or whatever like that. I'm not trying to pick on them. I'm just saying, like, um, like if I were in a position to coach them, this is the kind of stuff where I'd be saying like, okay, try to flesh this out more. This is where your argument's kind of weak at an argumentative level. You haven't really bridged this gap in your logic. And while these are, I mean, they're national finalists for this, so like better than most people who are trying to do what they do, and the people who don't try to do what they do are usually worse at this. They're better than a lot of like a huge amount of people. I just think there are still flaws, and we can always seek to improve, right? So please don't take this as me picking on high schoolers.
I argue there are two truths fundamental to a democratic conception of the individual moral agent. The first truth is that citizens can't use the law to shirk their own moral responsibility.
Okay, I'm gonna back this up. It sounds like he's setting up. It sounds like he's setting up a couple of subpoints. So his second contention. Let's hear.
Contention is that civil disobedience functions as a reciprocal check against society.
Civil disobedience functions as a reciprocal check against society. I'll let him flesh out the argument. To my ears, that sounds like it is a pragmatic appeal, that it is useful in this way, but that doesn't justify it morally, right? It could be useful, but you're more saying it's like legally justifiable, but that's not what we're talking about, or pragmatically justifiable. That's not what we're talking about. It seems a little bit beside the point, but we'll hear him out before we damn the argument in its entirety.
I argue there are two truths fundamental to a democratic conception of the individual moral agent.
Right, two truths.
The first truth is that citizens can't use the law to shirk their own moral responsibility. Throughout history, the claim, "I was just following orders," has been used to justify a wide variety of atrocities.
I don't even mind the hyperbolic invocation to justify what he's talking about. I think that's a reasonable argument, and he at the very least invoked what people would think of to justify it very quickly. He hasn't like laid the logical groundwork, but yeah, that's true, right? That your moral responsibility, like, is certainly just following the law is insufficient morally. And I think that's very reasonable. I think you could give a slightly better. Well, I guess it's a reasonable example. He didn't like flesh out the reasons why. He more like referenced a commonly understood reason why, though I have become less and less certain over the years since my high school debating days that people are in agreement about what that phrase means and what's wrong with saying you were just following orders. But if you can trust your audience to I guess bridge the gap, right? Like to fill in that argument you didn't make for you, then it's fine. And it's mostly reasonable. Though once I put it in those terms, it does kind of shine a light on like, well, then you didn't really make the argument. But he's still speaking. Let's let him finish.
But citizens can't ignore their conscience simply because the law says otherwise. The second truth is that law cannot be used to force individuals to suffer under oppression. Democratic respect for the individual entails a corresponding individual claim to resist outside domination.
I have to think about that one for a second. Like on a moral level, I guess he's saying the law cannot be used. I guess this is kind of a gesture towards oppression being inherently morally wrong. This is a way of getting around having to figure out how to like make your claims about your moral system or how to justify anything. You can simply it'd be like, well, obviously this, but if anyone's in disagreement with that, you haven't. Yeah, this again, it's just one of those like. There's a lot of assumptions built in here that I kind of forgot about since I did competitive debate. There's just a lot of assuming that's being done that I think isn't sufficiently justified, and the analysis and argumentation is severely lacking.
Civil disobedience functions to amplify the ideas of minorities, allowing them to enter into the democratic sphere as legislation or court decisions or be discarded. Jonathan Wolfe writes in his book.
So, yeah, that's a tool, I guess. Okay, so I just see that this argument opens them up to a very obvious counter argument of like, you also have legal tools. And what reason do you have for using illegal, things that what reason do you have to break the law when you could just not break the law and engage in similar protest? The argument I would make as a proponent in this way is to say that when you are trying to right a wrong, the law shouldn't get in your like the especially immoral laws shouldn't be a thing that holds you back. Like the law shouldn't be a deference towards immorality. If you're how do I put this in a way that's not as like I'm pretty comfortable with drastic actions to right wrongs. And I don't this is not a call for political violence. What I mean is if you're unheard, then you need to do what it takes to do what's right, to end slavery, to stop genocide, to so on and so forth. And to say, well, I could have done it, except the law says I wasn't allowed to protest or whatever, that's pretty stupid. Especially when we're talking about civil disobedience, which is peaceful, generally speaking. It is non-violent, like definitionally. So I don't care. Actually, a pretty reasonable example is the uh, the Chicago Seven. At least as I understand it, I didn't do much research on it, but I watched the movie, which I think is to some extent. There are certain things I can expect to be accurate about it, including that the protests that were going on in Chicago in, I believe, was it 1969, 67? It was basically protesting the Democratic nominee who was going to be in opposition to Nixon. Um, but the protesters weren't allowed permits for their protests, and thousands of people were showing up. I think it was like tens of thousands or something. And the fact that they weren't given their permits, that the government said no, you're not allowed to protest, I think is insufficient to say, well, therefore they shouldn't protest anyway. They weren't hurting anybody. The riots were started, according to the Justice Department, by the police. What they did were protesting a wrong they saw happening, which was that the Democratic nominee was insufficiently anti-war in Vietnam, and I think they had a right to do that, and that's what I mean here. Like, and so this is where I think it's like a little bit of a well, this is why I think it would be justified even if it's in violation of law. But the argument he's made kind of opens them up to saying, well, why not just protest in a legal way? Because he hasn't. I guess his primary value is morality, but he hasn't really impacted to that in a way where he says like, and damn the consequences. This is what needs to be done. This is what's good, and I don't care what it takes to get there.
book, An Introduction to Political Philosophy. Treating conscientious disobedience as treason in order to preserve social unity is surely a mistake. The dissenting citizen has a place. He or she should not be silenced for the sake of peace. Perhaps the majority is wrong. But even if the majority is right, attention still should be paid to dissenters. By way of analogy, even though an individual can use their right to free speech to distribute racist propaganda, this doesn't mean that free speech itself is immoral. Disobedience by unions like the
Okay, so this kind of puts to rest what I was talking about previous, or I shouldn't say puts to rest, but at least addresses something I was thinking about in the beginning, which was that, well, civil disobedience, when used for immoral ends, I think isn't justified. But that's because the ends are immoral. He is doing what I was saying, where you kind of have to assume, either assume only being civil disobedience is only being used for moral ends, or do what he did, which I hadn't considered, which is to say that that this tool being usable towards immoral ends does not delegitimize it. It's a knife can be used to to cut your dinner, or it can be used to murder somebody. But the fact that you can use it for the latter doesn't mean that it is not a useful tool for positive ends, like eating more easily. I'm trying to also factor in like what I think about this. I think that would demonstrate more that like if it's just a tool, then it's not. I guess you could say like therefore it is morally justified because like it's not really good or bad. But I would argue that is a problem with the resolution and not a de facto answer to the question. But I guess you could say like, okay, therefore I've answered the question. It is morally justified because it's just a tool. It's not really good or bad, and it's not. Yeah, if it's not neither good nor bad, then it's morally justified. I suppose it's like it's morally neutral, which is I suppose justified. Um, I wonder that because I know you could write critiques on the affirmative. I wonder if you could write one here in that way. I don't. A critique on the affirmative never really made sense to me, and I'm not sure how you would do it. Maybe this is how you would. I'm gonna get away from that. I'm just gonna like follow the debate, but that seems to be what he's saying. That just because you can use it to promote negative ends doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad.
WW led to the introduction of the 40-hour work week and other workers' benefits. Women's suffrage groups also used the tactic to gain the vote. Yet just as civil disobedience is a check upon society, society checks civil disobedience. When Alabama Governor George Wallace tried to block implementation of desegregation laws, the National Guard was called in to fix the problem. Notice that all of these examples used the democratic process to try and effect change. None of them rejected the majoritarian system of lawmaking in any way. Individuals accepted punishment to publicize their message, which was then considered democratically and either accepted or rejected. Notice also that even though the intent of civil disobedience may be to cause change, the fact that it fails in some instances doesn't make it unjustified.
That's really interesting. He seems to be arguing against the idea that if it is ineffective, it is unjustified. It's kind of a weird assumption. It wouldn't even occur to me. I wonder if we'll get more about that. But an attempt to cause positive change, even if unsuccessful, doesn't make it unjust. Like the success of your attempt doesn't affect its justification. I suppose you could argue if you do something really immoral as a means to an end and then it is ineffective, then that would be an issue. But then you're kind of assuming that like the civil disobedience is immoral if this is a concern you feel worth addressing. That's really weird to me. Yeah, that's really weird to me.
A politician who runs for office and loses is not wrong for doing so.
Yeah, he's even using it for things that are like that are not moral or not. Is this like because he was talking about failing to cause change. Is this like because that's another thing like liberalism tends to be like pretty status quo oriented, particularly like neoliberalism, but that there's this like change is bad and needs justification and whatever. Is this I wonder if this is just like listen, I know change is a bad thing, but you know and like trying to change stuff is immoral, but just because you fail doesn't make it like is he arguing against that? That's just so weird. Like I wouldn't think to mention any of this, and it doesn't really feel relevant to the topic at hand. So this is something that I hinted at prior. I wonder if we talked about it. It's like what he's saying you start to ask the question of like, what do you have to believe for this to be relevant? Like, what's going on in his head that he feels he has to clarify and justify attempts to make change that are unsuccessful? Uh, yeah, that's very, very strange to me.
Perhaps just unfortunately uncharismatic. Finally, it should be noted that civil disobedience can be a tremendously attractive option should the courts be unresponsive or the egregiousness of the problem especially demanding. At other times, it can be just one among many avenues, like the civil rights period, when disobedience, legal challenges, and grassroots efforts worked in tandem.
So this is an argument. So I wonder if he's getting to it, but this is an argument that I would make that there is a positive to civil disobedience in that it is a number of a set of tools. It contributes to a diversity of tactics that can be politically effective. Something that a friend of mine will often say is that people listened to MLK in as much as they did. He was pretty unpopular, sadly, even when he died, um, because the alternative to talking with him was letting Malcolm X wreak havoc. It was who he was the more palatable of the options, and in that way, Malcolm X was positively contributing in that he made MLK someone worth talking to. I don't know enough about Malcolm X to like speak to it past that. I just know a friend of mine like who knows a lot about this talks about it in this way, and like I understand like that those tactics are important. It's important for some people to engage completely legally, and some people to engage in civil disobedience, and some people to so on and so forth. It's important for some people to make video essays, and some people to do debates. As another example, as we talked about on Friday, he hasn't yet gotten to that, but this is really a positive good that I think addresses another issue that he could expect to face, which is that his opponent could say like all these things are good, but they would be better accomplished without the civil disobedience. But effectiveness is really important. This is why like the primary value of morality is another flaw there is that being effective in creating that change is a good is so like being like political effectiveness might be a better value criterion than his individual conscience, which I still don't understand. And you can say something to the effect of a diversity of tactics increases the ability to cause positive change and achieve moral ends, and that is impossible without this diversity of tactics and to do things merely in the way that the law has agreed acceptable, which is already like again kind of a repugnant idea to me that the government can tell you how to oppose it. Creating that's creating oh what's the word it's like planned opposition or I forget the term, but like it's creating it's kind of wild to even suggest that that might be the case. But if this is the world we're going to operate in, then you can say like it's more effective if there are more options available to people trying to cause positive change.
And to be sure, civil disobedience is often difficult, or the threat of punishment may discourage its use. But it's the affirmative argument that the decision to use civil disobedience should be the individual's alone. If the individual wishes to accept the punishment and the risks that go with it in order to assuage his or her conscience, he or she is entirely morally justified.
So yeah, at the end of this, I don't find that he had justified it. Like honestly, I'm starting to feel like this is kind of a bad example of what competitive debate looks like because his arguments were just really bad. Like he didn't really justify anything. He made allusions to he there were some statements that I think were very clear and I agreed with, but he didn't argue for them well. Nor do I think that he actually proved the point that it's morally justified. He didn't even really talk about what it would mean to be morally justified. But now we're going to see, like, with no pause to think about it, now the negative has their 3 minutes of cross examination. One of the reasons I liked this portion so much is, you're thinking on your feet. You're live reacting, as it were. Imagine. You're trying to find flaws in your opponent's arguments and poke and prod them while, doing this kind of on the fly without having the opportunity to plan out your strategy. Now that said, you can do some amount of pre-planning. You can have some expectations of what your opponent is going to say, but for the most part, you are generally reacting and thinking on your feet. Oh, notice he's holding the egg timer. Ah, classic. I miss it. Gotta have much time. Yeah, they both have it.
Okay, so you say that. Okay, so you say that basically because people are accepting punishment, they're morally justified in doing whatever their conscience tells them to do.
Well, that's part of the reason. I mean, it's not doing whatever their conscience tells them to do. There's a pretty strict definition of what it means to be civilly disobedient, which is completely different from what it means to be revolutionary.
So that's kind of interesting. We are from the outset. This is kind of a bad faith question, but that's very common in these kinds of debate. You're trying to get your opponent to agree to something that is harmful for them. It's not good form, but it happens constantly. And then, of course, the response is like, well, not anything you want, not anything revolutionary, of course, which is like again that like very liberal mindset of like, but civil disobedience is okay. But then you're kind of presupposing the answer a little bit. Like, well, you can't do anything you want, but civil disobedience is like isn't revolutionary and like is kind of and therefore okay. But you're assuming that it's okay. You haven't demonstrated that it is okay. You're just saying like, well, I am making this caveat that this is acceptable. Therefore, like your individual conscience, if you want to engage in it, makes it reasonable. It's I'm even having a hard time duplicating it because it's so circular.
Like, my argument is that civil disobedience, as a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, has built-in limitations upon it, and that just as democracies recognize the inherent right of individuals, that means that civil disobedience has to proceed without violating those other inherent rights, which means that there are constraints
Okay, wait.
upon
So what if?
So that doesn't make any sense at all. Being non-revolutionary is not really relevant to this. Hold on, we'll back it
Just
up.
as democracies recognize the inherent right of individuals, that means that civil disobedience has to proceed without violating those other inherent.
Wait, so just democracies recognize individual rights, and so civil disobedience has to engage without violating those rights. Why is that the case? Like, you are in fact violating some rights with certain kinds of civil disobedience. Sit-ins qualify as civil disobedience, and you are in some ways violating someone's property rights. You're present on their property, not leaving when told to. It's not quite trespassing because it's like it's a business. Oftentimes in businesses or like where they have the right to refuse, but if you're not leaving, you are in violation of the law, and the thing you're violating are someone's property rights, at least as recognized by the state. So like he's like assuming into what he means by civil disobedience that well nothing really bad will happen. You won't do anything like really harmful. So it's okay. But he hasn't justified or demonstrated, or he's just kind of like assuming away all of the challenges to his position.
Rights, which means that there are constraints
Okay, wait.
upon
So what if
So there are
someone's conscience?
constraints upon it, but like the constraints, at least definitionally, are things like not doing violence and ceding to the punishment. But that doesn't that's not a moral that just like the only thing you can say is morally justified about that is that you're not doing violence to somebody else, but there are other immoral actions you can do that are non-violent.
Tells them that other people's rights aren't valuable or that they should start a
Hold on,
revolution.
I missed this
So
part.
what if someone's conscience tells them that other people's rights aren't valuable or that they should start a revolution?
Well, I would argue
So
that's
now
not-
he's a what? Why are you approaching it in this way? So he's saying, so he asked, so what if their conscience tells them that it's okay to like do a revolution, but that is accepting that it would be bad to do revolution, which I guess his opponent's already like that's something his opponent's committed to. So like that is a fine way of approaching it, I guess, in as much as like it's something your opponent thinks is immoral. That's kind of the problem, right? What we mean by immoral is so vague that like you can only really address what your opponent is already on record as saying is immoral. But like this approach, I guess this is an attack on the Via criterion of like, well, individual conscience is so uncertain. This is kind of what we're talking about. Like if someone's conscience thinks that like slavery is fine or segregation is okay, like I guess okay. So I guess I don't hate that he's approaching it this way. I just had to talk it out a little bit because it seemed a little bit like accepting his terms. But I suppose you have to if you're attacking the value criterion. I thought he was making an argument generally, but if you're only going after the problems with the value criterion, then this is fine.
justified. I mean, that's not what civil
Okay, wait.
disobedience
So we
is.
do have moral obligations to other people that take precedence over doing what we think is moral.
My argument is that there's individual disagreements over what it means to be moral. Now, since a democracy values the individual as the fundamental agent of moral choice, the individual should be able to accept punishment or act insofar as they don't harm other individuals. That's just because of the uncertainty that goes with knowing what is and what isn't moral, and also because of the fundamental value that democracies place on the individual.
Like, okay, I get what he's saying, but this also has issues of like, okay, but what you mean by harming an individual is very nebulous here. You mean doing physical violence to somebody, but violating property rights, which civil disobedience often it can, at the very least, engage in, would you know is something he just seems to not really consider. Like that's a thing that can happen.
Okay, so there are limits on how people can express what they believe, right?
I'm sorry, what?
Okay, you basically say that we can express our conscience insofar as we don't harm other people. Therefore, there are limits on how we can express our moral beliefs, correct?
So that's a good question. Even if you have a moral belief, there are limits to how. Now, I guess I think everyone would agree with this, and I would agree as well. There's like, you can't be like, well, I'm opposed to I'm opposed to colonialization, therefore I'll do a genocide to protect against it. Like obviously, the harm there is far greater than what you're trying to prevent. So it's a good way of getting. It's like it's something he basically has to agree to, and can lead to, well, therefore maybe these things should be off the table as well.
Yeah, sure. It's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, so you don't use violence because you don't challenge the legitimacy.
It's weird that he's conflating violence with revolutionary, because those two things don't have to be the same. The revolutions can happen all through legal mechanisms, uh, all through like legal channels, non-violent channels. Theoretically, right? You can. Actually, it did happen in this country. If I'm remembering my history correctly, the first version of the United States was under the Articles of the Confederation, which didn't last very long, and then the Constitution was written, and like, okay, we'll use this form. That you could call revolutionary, but it was nonviolent. But he's like conflating these two terms, which is like it really bothers the like radical lefty part of me.
Of the state. That means a couple things. One, it means that you accept the ability of the state to punish you. But two, it means that since the state is the organ in society with a monopoly on legitimate violence,
if civil disobedience is morally justified, then why is the state morally justified in punishing the civil disobedient?
Because the disobedient recognizes that there is value in law.
That's a good question, and he's not answering it. So I'm gonna back it up.
Because you
justified, then why
a monopoly on legitimate violence?
If civil disobedience is
oh, and notice he keeps cutting off his opponent here. He only has so long. He can't just let him go, and it might come across as rude, but it's really not, and it shouldn't be seen as that. This is just how you have to do. You have to get through these questions, and you have to get to it.
Morally justified, then why is the state morally justified in punishing the civil disobedient?
Yeah, if it's moral to do it, then why is it moral to punish it? Now, my answer would be it isn't moral for the government to punish these actions, but the fact that it is doing it doesn't make it moral. But an individual who engages in civil disobedience understands that they will be punished. Not that it's good, but that's not the answer that we get. Instead, we get
the disobedient recognizes that there is value in
because
law.
They recognize that. Oh, I guess that there's value in law. Oh my God, this is so liberal. Oh my God.
There's moral value in the state.
But if
you're saying there's moral value in the state, but like that doesn't really answer the question, right? How could if it's moral, like you'd have to accept the bullet you'd have to bite is that it is moral for the government to punish people for doing moral things, which seems to be a pretty clearly contradictory set of positions. Like you'd have to get really into to ethical philosophy to justify all of that, but at a surface level it seems at its face pretty clear why that doesn't make any sense.
But if the civil disobedient thinks that what they do is morally justified, then why would they let the state punish them?
That question doesn't make very much sense. There are a lot of reasons that might have nothing to do with morality. Sometimes it's because you get attention for being punished for a thing. This is like a quasi-martyrdom. You're not getting executed by the state, but you're being punished for doing what's right. It looks good. That might be a reason. it's not the reasons for this might not be on moral grounds, or maybe they accept their punishment because they recognize they don't have the kind of power to really resist it. If you're getting arrested at a protest and there's a dozen police officers nearby, all of whom are armed, your resistance to that isn't going to end well. And I don't recommend getting yourself hurt in that way. It's a really bad idea. And so maybe that's why because it's infeasible, but it's not. It has nothing to do with morality. It's not a great question. Which is this is where we see it's a little bit of, even though they're good at what they do in comparison to their peers, it's a little bit like they're still in high school. They're still learning. I do think he asked some very good questions so far, but this one's got a little bit of a misstep.
If they think the state is arresting them unjustly, why would they
Right, no,
accept
okay,
the
okay.
arrest?
The argument is that the state is enforcing an unjust law from the individual perspective. That doesn't mean, though, that the state is unjust or immoral in actually enforcing the law.
So we're
it just
looking
means
at
that
this
the
from an
individual
individual
is
perspective?
choosing to accept punishment as a way to
This
cast
is
light
like this
on
deference
the
to the
immoral
state that
law that
is
they see in the
Why
weird
can't we
and
cast light within legal
creepy.
channels?
You can.
Okay, then why is civil
Law
Wait,
that
hold
they
on.
see in the
Why can't we
government.
cast light within legal channels?
You can.
Okay, then why is civil disobedience morally justified if we have another option?
Well, you can do
See, this is the question that I expected, right? That we talked about before. If you can do it legally, why engage in civil disobedience if your options that don't require a violation of the law? Now, this is a little bit of a deference to the law that I was surprised at, given the question about um, being moral to both break the law and to accept the punishment. I liked that question mostly because it gets to interesting philosophical ground, not because it's a good question to prove his position. But here we seem to be going back to, well, the law is like an inherent moral good.
do lots of things many different ways in a democracy. I can run for office or start an initiative or go talk to my representative. The fact that there are 3 different ways to get legislation introduced into a locality doesn't mean any of them are unjustified. I mean,
Okay.
the fact that I can walk.
So he a little bit avoided the question, because obviously that's true that there are a lot of ways doesn't mean that, like, one is unjustified. But if the question that's being asked is like, if you can do all of these things that don't cause this like harm to law, or like, which is we're kind of assuming is at some level moral, maybe even the question about how it can be moral to punish it, maybe what he was getting at was saying, well, if it's moral to punish them, then what they've been doing must be immoral. I guess I was being a little too charitable there. Then there seems to be this like idea that law is the good, but even if you don't take that in, you can say, okay, well, there is some amount of harm being done with civil disobedience. If you have tools other than that, why use the one that causes even a small amount of harm? Is the way I would ask that question, and there are good answers to that, but that's not what he's kind of not addressing that. It's all he's kind of this liberal mind person. I wonder how much I'm going to be able. I should stop talking about it because I keep going on about it, but it's all over the place and it's getting in the way of the actual philosophical argument.
Walk or drive to the store doesn't mean that I'm a terrible person if I choose to drive.
Okay, let's go back to the idea of conscience. What if my conscience does tell me to harm other people? Should I listen to my conscience?
No, you can't. The argument I give you is that though individual consciences differ, the recognition of the inherent value in the individual in a democratic system puts checks on what an individual can and cannot do. I mean, it's all there in the definition if you want to look at it.
So one, I like how you can hear the beeper, the timers beeping in the background of like, all right, time's up. But I don't love this like, well, it's all there in my definition. You didn't justify your definition. You just said like, this is what this guy says about it, and like, therefore it's good. What if you could have your definition of the thing, but it still could have problems with it, or things that it accepts that are immoral, or whatever else. There's a lot of non-argument happening here, and it's actually really frustrating. I remember a lot more actual argumentation occurring, even where in the levels I was debating, which was not national finals. This is actually kind of disappointing so far.
Okay.
All right, are we going to sit? So he has. Okay, so there's gonna be a bit of a pause here, and I'll just blather during this time. So there's 3 minutes of prep time that each side has throughout the course of the debate, but they don't get it. How do I put it? They have 2 instances where they could use it. There's after their instance of cross-examination, and before their last speech. But they don't have 3 minutes each of those time periods. They have 3 minutes total. So allocating that is also an important skill. I tried to use as little of it as possible here, so I'd have as much as I needed later. But then the more I got used to debating and got used to the kinds of arguments that I would encounter, and got used to thinking very quickly and like having responses on the fly, as I'm doing now, where I immediately have a response to this, I would, you're obviously encouraged to write down some arguments during your opponent's speech, though not so much that you'll miss what they say. I ended up not needing very much prep time, and I would sometimes just not use very much at all. I felt it was a little bit of a show of force, which could be useful, but also a little bit of keep the flow going and make my responses seem to flow as opposed to having this pause before them. I don't know how effective it was, but that was my idea. So that's what's happening now. He's just doing some prepping.
But I just like to.
Okay. And now he's gonna have a speech. It sounds like he's gonna have some like thanks or whatever. But so far,
Before I start, I just like to thank the
weird.
Lincoln Financial
That's where
Group
you have
and
your
National
edit.
Forensic
Okay.
League for making it possible for us to debate
You edited
this
up
week.
his walk,
I'd
but
also like
you
to
didn't
thank
edit
my
up the
teammates,
prep
my
time.
coaches, all the Andes, and my parents and my sister. And also like to thank my God, because I'm sure he had a lot to do with this.
Ooh, okay.
With that, now let's turn to the negative. While the affirmative may make civil disobedience sound like a wonderful way to promote change, he never explains why change means one person should have more power than everyone else.
So my guess is this is part of his prepared speech, and I don't. People do this sometimes. I don't love it, where your prepared speech includes a description of what your opponent is done or is doing. It feels very much like you. It feels. It's intended to feel like you're listening and responding, but if you once you recognize it, it feels instead like it doesn't matter at all what he says. You're going to say this no matter what. Let me back it up.
Change. He never explains why change means one person should have more power than everyone else. Because
Whoa, what? One person has more power than everyone else? That's your description of civil disobedience? Excuse me, everyone has the ability to do these things. In what way is it more power? I mean, maybe he'll justify it, but from the outset, literally, what are you talking about?
civil disobedience fails to respect other people's rights to have a say in democracy, I negate.
No, they have, okay, so this is just his opening. Instead of his opening quote, he has like an opening claim. I guess it pulled me in, but not in a way I think he was like it's so divorced from reality. What do you like it doesn't okay, you can justify that later if you want.
The resolution asks whether civil disobedience is justified, so the value ought to be justice, defined as giving each his or her due.
Okay, so justice as a primary value I think is appropriate here. I'm worried that this is going to stray too much into the justice system and legality, but we'll see. And then he defined it as giving each his due. And so justice is one of those terms where it's like it's incredibly difficult to define. Uh so and this is what I mean like okay, just behavior or treatment, a just or oh, okay, well that's not appropriate. Here Merriam-Webster says the maintenance or administration of what is just. We don't see giving each his due. That definition is actually exceptionally old. I know I forget which book it's in, but one of Socrates' books. He talks about he gets definitions of justice from different people throughout town, and that's one of the ones he gets. That is a very old definition. It has problems with it that I don't imagine we'll get into, but I also wonder. Like it's like inherently contentious, and I don't think he can cite a source for it either. It's one of those like citing a source shouldn't be sufficient, but here in this kind of context, it is often seen as that. So like, okay, maybe he'll have that. Maybe he'll at least have that. I wonder if he'll even can. And then, but even if he does, it's pretty contentious, and you have to justify it. And I don't think he will.
Specifically, justice in a
no
democracy
substitute.
means giving each citizen his or her due in terms of political power and expression. Henry Mayo clarifies how democracy does this in an introduction to
So the problem I have with this definition of like giving each her is his or her due, especially in the context of a legal system, is like what is your due is nebulous and up for debate. You know, in 1800, what your due is in terms of the right to vote varies vary significantly as to how it is today. For example, if you simply are a woman, your due is not to get the right to vote. This is it kind of like seeds a lot of like, well, it's kind of like this is ought thing. In addition, and if you think that's disagreeable, if you say, oh, well, maybe that wasn't right, but like now you have to justify everything. It's kind of meaningless.
To democratic theory. Democracy is unique in recognizing the political expression of conflicting interests and opinions as legitimate.
Sure.
Democracy provides for the peaceful adjustment of disputes, the maintenance of order, and the working out of public policies by means of its compromise function.
Sometimes.
The benefit of this compromise is that all interests and opinions are expressed and weighed fairly when no one can agree.
So, it is really interesting to me to note that this is his idea of democracy in 2004, shortly after the beginning of the Iraq War, where that was very loudly protested against. A lot of people were in opposition to, but it happened anyway. And it wasn't through compromise, we'll only do half a war. It was, we did the whole thing, irrespective of people's thoughts on the matter. Now, I don't know well enough what the relative support for, like, I don't know if the majority of the country wanted to go to war or not. But this is a really weird way of looking at democracy, especially in the United States, given that it's on the heels of a pretty clear refutation by example that happened. Yeah, it's a little weird.
Rather than one person's interest dominating the rest. Therefore, the criterion for justice is fair consideration of interests.
Fair consideration of interests as a value criterion for justice. The word fair is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, but like it feels similarly meaningless to his opponents. I prefer justice as a value in this regard, but I would look at justice in a more closely in line with how MLK had discussed it, where it is not the absence of chaos, but the sorry, it was a peace. It was like the presence of justice. Sorry, I'm slipping up with, I'm mixing up my MLK quotes there, but justice might require civil disobedience to attain, and if that's our primary goal, you can justify it. And this is, I think, a bit of a hallmark of a good primary value in debate is that it can justify the opposing position if they appeal to it correctly. It shouldn't be something like, well, you can only really get there one way. I guess morality works too. It's just so ill-defined it doesn't apply.
Peter Singer writes, the decision procedure in which all members have equal say in decisions and then accept the result is a paradigm of fair consideration. It is beneficial since a peaceful settlement of disputes is better than settlement by force.
So what we mean by like fair consideration of all involved is like is where the problem is, right? Fair consideration is that there are let me give a good example. It's 2016 presidential election results. Because in 2016, the popular vote, I want to see more of the numbers. I can't spell. Whatever. Statistics. Okay. How is this for a fair consideration of everyone's opinions or whatever? Hillary Clinton received 227 electoral votes, and Donald Trump received 304. So he should win, right? But 65 million people, I guess we can round up, 66 million people voted for Hillary Clinton and 63 million voted for Trump. So shouldn't she have won the election? What is fair? And that's why I said the word fair is doing a lot of legwork. Is what do we mean by a fair consideration of all involved? What will we accept as fair? And often what we accept as fair is what civil disobedience is used to protest. It was fair consideration of all involved, quote unquote, when there was a poll tax, and that just meant black people couldn't vote in the South. It was fair consideration of all involved when, when black people were slaves according to the South, right? Because that's where their place is, it's fair consideration, just like they would have said with livestock, because unfortunately that's how slaves were considered. It's again like presupposing a lot of agreement where there isn't necessarily, and um, not factoring in the idea that, hey, maybe that's not what we actually have.
And it is just because it evaluates each interest fairly.
So, well, see, like you're assuming the fair, right? So then, like that could be reasonable. You could just say, okay, if it were done fairly, then it would be good. Maybe he's not necessarily going to bat for electoral politics in the way that we have them in the United States. To be clear, he's not necessarily saying that that is just, but he is waving away the unfairness by just assuming what is fair. And then we're going to go on to see whether he talks about concrete ideas and examples of what's going on, and then say what, that civil disobedience is unjustified. One of the things to keep in mind as well is that if there was fair consideration of all involved, maybe we wouldn't need civil disobedience. Maybe that wouldn't be a thing that, maybe that wouldn't be required. For example, with with the civil rights movement in the 1960s, if there were if there were fair consideration of all involved, they wouldn't need to be protesting. And so there's this like weird thing of like, you want to, it's that's why I presumed that he meant the current system is an example of that as opposed to the alternative, because otherwise you're talking about something that doesn't exist, and you'd have to make a lot of claims that are impossible to evaluate.
My contention is that civil disobedience denies fair consideration of interests by asserting the power of one person over the rest of society and legitimizing the use of coercion to resolve disagreements.
Coercion?
Civil disobedience, editor Dwight Murphy notes, is exquisitely embroidered with love and goodwill, but stripped to its essentials, it is the concept that every man can be his own judge and jury and legislator, that a minority has the right to flout the law, to force its will upon society.
I didn't expect that this was the route we were going. I guess he would have to, because we're not going to get... Yeah, I guess he has to argue against the concept. But no, it's absolutely not. I mean, he hasn't defined anything, which often the negative doesn't, because sometimes they just accept the affirmative's definitions, or they'll have their definitions, but it doesn't matter. We're just going to talk about the words without referencing what they mean. But in as much as he hasn't referenced a definition for civil disobedience, he'd have to accept his opponents, which is definitionally not being the judge, jury, and executioner for oneself, because it is accepting the punishment of the state. Now, obviously, this is his case and not a response to his opponent, but this is where it's like, it's so like, but if this is a thing that can happen, define civil disobedience.
The law, unlike free speech or legal protests, unjustly limits the rights of others by undermining the role they had in making that law in the first place.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. So he's saying like it undermines the democratic process, the like fair consideration of all involved by disobeying these laws that we've all agreed to. But this is what I mean. Like, did we actually fairly do that? Like, because it wasn't fair is why we need to civilly. If it were fair, this wouldn't be necessary. This is okay.
There's no point to voting for the stance you want if someone can just override your vote at any time by refusing to obey the authority of the vote's result. Singer explains, in claiming that his own judgment entitles him to a greater say
so
in the
now
matter
you have
than
to
the
agree
others,
that
the
all
dissenter
law
is making a claim.
So now he's in a position where he has to basically agree that every law is moral, and that like opposition to it is immoral. Like like he'd have to argue that slaves running away to the north were immoral. They were engaging in I mean, you could argue that's civil disobedience, right? Like, you're violating the law in a non-violent way and denying this person their property rights at the time. And I would say that that's a good thing to do, but by this paradigm, he has to be like, nah, man, everyone had a chance to factor in these laws, so sucks to suck. You're making everyone else suffer for this. You don't have the right, idiot. Like, he has to say something like that. Now he might say, well, that wasn't a fair consideration. Well, guess what, buddy? Still not. So I was referencing the 2016 presidential election, but you know what's fun is that hadn't happened yet, but there was one in another similar time, is the 4 years prior. I just want cool. Where hey, boom, look at this, less than 500,000 votes between the two of them. There was some possible shenaniganry in Florida, but it seems like even with that, Al Gore got the popular vote, but not the electoral vote. Is this the fair consideration of all involved? Not to mention felons being unable to vote, or even in cases where like they probably should be allowed to vote again, or people I don't know what voter ID laws were like at the time, often, or polling places being hard to access. It's not a holiday, so if you have to work, poor people tend to lose their right to vote because they don't have access. This is the fair consideration of all involved. All right, buddy.
Which the others could make, and which, if many of them did make, would be incompatible with a peaceful decision procedure. Due to the impossibility of reaching agreement, it would be best if everyone accepted compromise instead of acting on their own individual judgments.
But compromise isn't what we get.
A society in which everyone acted on individual judgments will legitimize use of coercion to solve disagreements. Civil disobedience upsets legal avenues.
So now we have another conflation. This is another instance where you can like be on the lookout for dishonest tactics. They happen all the time, even in competitive debate. Some might even say, especially in competitive debate. Now he's conflating coercion with civil disobedience. The implication being that you are threatening people with violations of the law, which he's kind of conflating a little bit with like being harmful, right? With like, and he's also saying is undermining their right to the democratic process if you don't get your way. That's what he's calling civil disobedience, which is highly dishonest.
Change, like public forums, where disagreements can coexist. Instead, it turns disagreement into conflict. When your spoken argument is made useless by the direct action of others, the only way to defend your beliefs is with retaliatory action. For example,
and now, of course, it's retaliatory action, but of course, oftentimes, it's not retaliatory. It is an action that is done because well, maybe you could call it retaliatory, but like it's most frequently done in civil rights and progressive movements, because those tend to be underrepresented in the halls of power. Are you going to say the civil rights movement was a retaliatory action, or would you say that these people were legitimately oppressed and therefore needed to whatever tools they needed to use to free themselves from that oppression?
If a racist restaurant owner decides to civilly disobey an equal rights protection law by kicking a black man out of his shop...
I love the example. Not the example that actually happened, which is the opposite of a segregationist business owner kicking out a person of color. No. It's the other way around. Oh my god, let's listen to that again. That's
the only
insane.
way to defend your beliefs is with retaliatory action. For example, if a racist restaurant owner decides to civilly disobey an equal rights protection law by kicking a black man out of his shop, the only way that man can get to eat inside the restaurant is if he forces his way in. Far from giving the minority a check against the majority, civil disobedience overrides checks that already exist in the law.
That is insane to me. Who let him say this out loud? Who let him, obviously the first thing people are going to think of with civil disobedience is the 1960s civil rights movement. And he has the audacity to be like, oh, it's the civil disobedience of the racist to kick out a black guy because he's opposed to anti-segregation laws. No one checked this guy. No one was like, hey, maybe don't say those words out loud, because not only does that make any sense, it's also pretty messed up. All right. I don't know. Where's his team on this?
Turning disagreement into a battle of might is right, where the strongest group wins.
Which, of course, is preposterous, considering you're the one being like, nah, the law is what's good. You can't disobey it. We all had a hand in that, and not, the few people who have access to the levers of power. We're not the right makes right side. It's you, because you want individual rights. This is insane to me. This does feel very, well, not, yeah, it feels very right wing, but I don't know if this guy is necessarily. In my experience, competitive debaters seem to skew left leaning, or at the very least liberal leaning. But this is very like, what's that? You want to protest? You authoritarian? You should be under the boot of the state instead. That's how we get freedom.
Supreme Court Justice Charles Whitaker writes, minority groups, in preaching and practicing defiance of the law, are in fact advocating erosion and destruction of the only structure.
Hold on. I want to know who this justice is. All right, because this sounds like some anti-civil rights shit. All right, so in office, in the early '60s, became the first person. All right, I want to know about his rulings. Let me see. Wow, I'm reading this and like, whoo! I'm obviously not reading it out loud. I'm trusting you to read it if you want to read it, but I want to see what his rulings were. And I don't really see any. He struggled to find a judicial philosophy. All right, it's not super important, but I was wondering if this guy, like, because this quote sounds like some anti-segregationist, or sorry, some pro-segregationist shit.
Structure that can permanently maintain due process and the equal protection of the laws, and thereby protect them from discriminations and abuses. The key reason why democracy works is that people can express their beliefs in legal ways, such as public forums, voting, or legal protests, but refrain from acting on those beliefs in favor of peace and fairness. Civil disobedience destroys both, and that's why we negate.
Oh, and by the way, this resolution strikes me as a little bit dangerous in a way that I hadn't really considered up until this point, because it bounds the it bounds the edges of discussion. It's to say, like, when you have people going off like this about civil disobedience, which, let's be real about what we're talking about. We're talking about like a sit-in, or we're talking about like Rosa Parks sit in the front of the bus. We're talking about non-violent acts that are technically in violation of law, to shine a light on the problems there. If we're saying, like, if we can get people railing against that, then, like, if those are the bounds of it, you leave more extreme action out. Like, oh, it's to say the only discussion we can have is whether this is okay or not. We're not even going to consider if other things are okay. Now, it's not obviously what the resolution says, but it just kind of like frames the discussion. When you have this extreme of like, when you have someone going off like that, like, it would be so bad if someone did a sit-in. It's coercion and violating democratic rights of the majority to do a sit-in. Imagine what it would say about, like, well, your permit for a protest wasn't approved and then you protested anyway. This is yeah, it's very, I don't know, it strikes me as kind of seeding very negative way of looking at the world.
Now let's turn to the affirmative side. He gives you this value of morality and
okay, so it wasn't as clearly signposted as I would often do, but this is a transition. He just finished his actual case. Notice it was very short, and now he's going to go over to rebut. And so these should be the end of prepared statements.
Criterion of individual conscience. Put them together because basically he defines morality as what the individual likes. However, while it's easy for my opponent to justify disobedience by looking at the problem through the eyes of one person at a time, it would be easy for it to be moral, because then I would do whatever I think is right.
So now he's he's doing what I thought he would do, going after the value criterion, which is a good idea. But now he's approaching it by saying the exact opposite of what his opponent answered in the cross-examination. This is also like some bad faith questioning of, like, I'll ask the question, but it doesn't matter what you say. I'm going to say that you are cool with anything a person comes to the conclusion that they should do, even though his opponent actively did not say that and said that that they do not agree with that.
However, the resolution is about individuals in the context of a democracy, which is a society containing multiple people. Therefore,
No
the
way.
only way to universally justify the resolution as a general principle is by affirming for all people at the same time collectively. In other words, disobedience must...
Individual rights don't apply to exactly one person. They apply to everyone, and we have bridged the gap. Suddenly, yes, everybody has that right, but we're talking about it using it on an individual level. Yes, then other people
must be justified for everyone in a democracy. Now, if everyone has absolute moral authority and absolute individual conscience, as he claims...
Now he's talking about these in extreme terms. Absolute moral authority. We're like permuting nuance out of the conversation. I remember that this would happen, but...
This will always conflict, and then none will matter. But law limits absolute rights so everyone can enjoy them, at least partially. Because multiple people have equal rights, the only way to maximize them for an entire society as once is to have obligations that consider others as well as yourself.
Well, this is why we're talking about civil disobedience and not extreme action, right? We're not talking about political violence. We're talking about civil disobedience. That's why these are the bounds of the conversation. But when civil disobedience is the rowdy behavior, he gets to talk about it in the same way that you would political violence, where he's talking about it in these like you're doing some great awful harm to people. Like, it's a sit-in, dude. It's a sit-in. Like, it's really not that big a deal. But we're talking about it in these absurd terms, like, okay, now everyone has the absolute right to do,
He admits this in cross-examination, where he tells you that even if your individual conscience tells you to harm other people, you can't do that, because you have to consider your moral obligations to other people before you consider your moral obligations to do whatever you think is right.
So, this is a little, but this is an issue I think I'm going to keep having with this guy, is that he's making arguments that are to the effect of, you have, like, doing what you think is right. It's like you have a choice between considering others and doing what you think is right, and he's trying to act like the latter is so frivolous, as if people, like, in the civil rights movement, weren't considering the rights of other people. Like, it was just like, well, I want to be able to vote, so damn, like, fuck you, I'm gonna do the sit-in or whatever, and not that it is with consideration to others. And you know what? Yeah, it is. The reason why it's civil disobedience and not political violence that these people would do is because they did consider that, yeah, it would be pretty bad to just go murdering people, but doing a sit-in is expressing the dissent in a loud way that gets attention, but ultimately isn't that harmful, even though it's a violation of the law. But he's acting like it's not that.
At that point, you can't look towards this absolute value of morality with the criterion of individual conscience, because everyone has their own conception of morality. That's why you look towards the value of justice, to make sure that everyone has their due in expressing their own moral beliefs and their own individual conscience. And you look towards the criterion of fair consideration of interest, because that criterion prioritizes your moral obligations to other people over your moral obligations to follow your own conscience.
Now, I do think that I think this last bit was actually a good argument. I agree with him that his value and value criterion make more sense, even though his value criterion is still nonsense and assumes a lot. But also, this isn't one thing that's cool to me about arguments about the primary value and value criterion, is that even if his opponent said, okay, fine, we'll use yours, he can still impact to justice, because ultimately justice and morality are not terribly different. Both are super nebulous in this, so we don't really know exactly what either means by each, but, like, justice and morality are sometimes used interchangeably. It's fine. It's the criterion that's more at odds, and I agree that, like, his makes a little more sense, but they're both nonsense. They both are ridiculous. And fair consideration of all interests or whatever, like, it doesn't happen. It's not what happens. And like, what if fair consideration of all interests leads to people agreeing that civil disobedience is warranted in a particular case, right? Like, I don't know.
Go to his contention 1 now. He talks about how laws can be immoral.
No, signposting. Go to his contention 1. Let's go.
However, the individual can be
I just want
immoral
to be
as
done with
well.
this.
He still hasn't proven any sort of definite benefit to the affirmative side.
This is what I meant about this being kind of awkward. Maybe it should have been in his definitions, but like that the law is just moral. He's like, yeah, well, the individual can be as moral as well. Yeah, sure, that's true, and that's only really a problem because he put this huge emphasis on like the individual right to whatever. Um, but it's like it sounds like he's not even really in disagreement with the argument that the law isn't always moral, which he needs to be because his position is kind of hinging on it.
In terms of morality. The problem is he talks about all these inhumane procedures, but the problem is that the law could just as well be protecting rights. I gave you the example of the Equal Rights Protection Law and make sure that whites and blacks can eat together in a restaurant.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that example. Yeah, I remember you saying it. Yeah, yep, we remember that. But yeah, but you have to be saying that the law is always justified because if it's not, then like, are you saying you haven't made any comment as to whether you should be limited in your action against unjust laws? In fact, you're kind of assuming out of the conversation that there can be such a thing.
But people can civilly disobey that on an individual level because racists might think that it's right to be racist. At that point, we can't even achieve morality because there's this problem of basically people can be wackos. Okay,
what?
Turn to his contention 2 now. He talks about how democracy looks towards the individual moral agent, and we always have our own individual responsibility to change laws. However, remember we can't change laws however we like. He admits in cross-examination that we have moral obligations to others that take precedence over how we would like to change laws. At that point, you can't change laws by doing whatever you like and enacting change by breaking laws. You have to work within the democratic procedure because it makes sure everyone has some sort of fair and equal say.
So the first half of that was actually a really good argument, right? He's saying you have obligations to others and not everything you want to do is justifiable. Instead, you have to figure out what is it. You have to argue about the specifics of stuff, which they seem both highly unwilling to do, which is why the affirmative just went, yeah, and civil disobedience is one of those things. Moving on. And this guy just went, no, it's illegal, so it's not one of those things. Moving on. But neither are really addressing it.
Then he says we can't be forced to suffer under oppression, but remember, I told you that laws can prevent oppression, like that Equal Rights Protection Law.
But they don't always. And the Civil Rights Protection Law exists because previously the laws weren't protecting against oppression in that way. Now you can argue to the extent to which those laws were successful, but the point is they definitely were not preventing oppression in the 1950s and prior. Yeah, it's so weird, the amount of hand waving of just like, we're just not going to talk about it. I honestly expected a lot better. I remember having debates that were more actually talking about the subject than this. I don't know. Maybe I'm just remembering wrong. Maybe I'm just like to think I was talking about it more, but maybe that's also why I was considered by a lot of people good at what I did, and even though I didn't succeed that much. But it does make me retroactively very upset that this is what's happening in the finals, but I couldn't. Like, I had very little success trying to make actual arguments on the actual subject at hand.
Because we have the right to free speech and people can use it for racist propaganda doesn't mean that the right to free speech is bad.
That's what we're using.
At that point, he's looking towards the moral justification of the act of civil disobedience itself. But that means that if we're only looking at the act, then he can't derive any benefits from expressing individual conscience, because we're no longer looking at the motives of individual conscience behind the act, we're only looking at the act itself.
I like that argument a lot. I think that was very concise and well put. If we're only talking about the actual civil disobedience, you can't be sure what it's being used for, right? But I forget what he too busy thinking about it. It was a good argument to remember exactly what his follow through was. But then you can say, well, if it's not about if we're only talking about what we're doing, then we can't be sure how it's being. Oh, hold on, what did he say? God damn it.
Act that he can't derive any benefits from expressing individual conscience.
Oh, okay.
Because we're no longer looking at the motives of individual
it's the impact to individual conscience.
We're only looking at the act.
But you've already rejected individual conscience. You should be impacting to your own value and criteria. You should have problems with. I guess in your view, you're like, it's already coercive and bad, and that's why. Okay, sure. But yeah, like, this is a little bit of like, it's a good argument of like, okay, then you can't justify any of the positive outcomes because you're only talking about this, like, not what they're trying to do with it, just that they're doing it. But then, I mean, you could argue it's morally neutral and therefore justified, or argue that that it's an irrelevant question. But I don't know. That's not what they're talking about at all.
Self. Finally, he talks about how if we accept punishment, it's all okay. However, a study from the University of North Carolina shows that even homicide committers accept punishment, but obviously they're still not morally justified in what they do.
Yeah, I guess I kind of agree. Like, just because you accept punishment doesn't make it okay. It's more just like he's saying, well, yeah, I guess this is a deference to the law, but you guys are both deferring to law. I don't know. Yeah, I agree that argument of his was very good. As of right now, I think the negative is doing a better job, but we haven't heard the affirmative make any counter arguments yet. So let's get into that. So now we're gonna have the affirmative cross examination.
Okay, sorry. What was the last thing you said? I just didn't hear it.
This is great. This is something that I'm so glad someone did. It's just like, hey, I want to clarify this point and make sure I don't miss it, and so asking about it.
They said that even if people accept punishment, that doesn't mean the act they committed or they accept punishment for is necessarily morally justified.
Yeah, and that's true. It's like it doesn't necessarily follow that accepting punishment makes the thing okay. Also, I don't know what he means about like serial killers accepting punishment. Like they might not be able to resist it, but that's not the same as accepting it. But you can shine a light on the nebulousness of what do you even mean by accepting punishment. But I forgot to mention when you do clarification, it is important to get it done first, just to make sure you have time for it, and then get into the argumentation or the argumentative questions.
Okay, so the criterion then is fair consideration of interests,
Sure.
right? And you say that we can't settle problems by force.
Right.
Okay, so if civil disobedience isn't forceful, and if I say any...
They're definitely using different ideas of what they mean by force. I think the negative is saying like any violation of the law is a use of force, whereas the affirmative is like he's kind of equating it with violence. And even as he's talking now, I kind of got that sense.
Anyone can be civilly disobedient. Have I met your standard?
Basically, I'm saying the way you morally justify civil disobedience sets up a decision procedure in which things do turn forceful.
Okay, so I just want to know exactly, just like so we can make this clear and so there's no ambiguity after this.
Okay.
The steps I need to go through to meet your standard of what it means
Oh, this
to
is a good question.
have fair consideration of interests.
Yeah,
The
get your opponent
first
to
is
set the
that
goalposts.
You can't be violent, right?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to just write these down. The first
The
is that
idea of fair consideration of interest is basically that the moral obligations you have towards others take precedence over doing whatever you like in your own individual
Okay,
conscience.
so the first is that it's nonviolent. The second is that it's universal, right? We say everyone should be able to do it.
Sure, you have to justify some sort of decision procedure for everyone.
This is
Okay.
great. Actually, this is a
And
really
so
good
if
line.
I
of
show you
questioning.
that an action is nonviolent, that it still respects other people, and that anyone can do it, I should win.
No.
Okay.
So this sounds funny because it sounds but like it's not just an action, right? It is an action that would be considered civil disobedience that is in violation of the law. But he is also the negative is also has positioned himself as, in a sense, saying that any violation of the law is violent. It would be a contradiction of terms to have a non-violent violation of the law, which I disagree with. But that's currently the setup, which is why it seems obvious to him to say no, and the audience laughs because it sounds like the affirmative laid out the like these are the criteria for what would be acceptable, and then you say it wouldn't be acceptable if I show it to you. It seems contradictory, but there's a justification for it. And you're taught it is a really bad idea to, if someone asks you if I do this I should win, never say yes. Like it's such a bad idea because that's what they're about to do, you know. Now that said, you can sometimes say yes. If in this case you could even say you'd clarify, well, if it was an act of civil disobedience, then yes, because he's defined the like violence in such a way where any violation of the law counts, and so it would be literally impossible. But yeah, if you could find a non-violent violation of the law, then yeah, sure, you could win. It's just literally impossible from the negatives position anyway.
Okay, so what other things should I do?
Okay, basically, I argue that civil disobedience is an act of, like, expressing your own belief over other people, right? Even if you say it respects others, the action itself doesn't respect others because it denies everyone's
So this is what I mean. He could have said yes, and then when his opponent tried to do this, like, well, but I've laid out that is inherently civil disobedience inherently does not respect the views of others.
Okay, so we just have to respect other people's authority. That's the fourth argument.
Okay, give me 1 second. I have a visitor. Give me a moment. I have a little visitor. My sister's dog was scratching at my door. He wanted to come in. He went to the groomer recently, so he is very hairless right now. But look how cute he is. He's very hairless right now, and he wants to lay on my bed. So he was scratching at the door for attention. But say hello, Snowball. Say hello. Hello, Snow. All right, you can go lay on my bed. Just please don't bark. Thank you. He likes to lay on my bed because it's all comfy. Also, I think he's very cold right now because like I said, he went to the groomers and is very furless right now to the point where like very little. It's a little cold and he's like trying to curl up and anything. Yes, no, you can lay. Okay, sure, lay on my pillow. Okay, whatever. All right. Pardon the interruption. Visitors sometimes don't wait for anyone. All right, let's proceed.
All we have to do is respect other people's authority.
I hope this has been interesting for y'all.
Plank of what I need to do in order to win.
I'm
sorry. That's the fourth
here because the microphones are kind of
echoing. So all we have to do is respect other people's authority, and that's the fourth plank of what I need to do in order to win.
I'm hearing fourth plank, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Your argument is that we respect other people by respecting their authority.
Sure. You're talking about like individual conscience, right? I'm saying everyone has an equal right to have individual conscience.
Right. So as long as we respect the authority of the majority, then we're respecting other people and we're meeting your criterion of fair consideration of interests.
So he's not wrong in saying like respect the authority of the majority because that is more or less what his opponent was saying, but his opponent probably wouldn't agree to it in those terms because he was saying like fair consideration of interests and you're violating people's you're violating what we have all agreed upon by violating the law. But at the end of the day, even in like the most positive view of American politics, it would be the authority of the majority. That's not how it works out, as we have seen. It's not even the authority of the majority. But like, he probably wouldn't agree to those terms. But the affirmative is kind of right in pegging him on like, well, it's about the authority of the people who make these laws.
Sure. Okay. So respect the opinion. Fabulous. Okay. Your argument is that the law can protect racists, right? And racists can do bad things.
Sure.
Okay. Now, I can vote for the Ku Klux Klan, even though certainly there's not a lot of fondness in that group for members of my religion. Like, I could still vote for them if I chose to, right?
Like, you mean people who... I think he means you can vote for people who are in the Klan for like public office, which, by the way, David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the KKK, like nearly won a gubernatorial run. It's kind of scary that that's a thing that happens.
Okay, now that doesn't mean that like voting itself is terrible, and in all likelihood the Klan is not going to win, or even if they do, there will be constitutional checks that prevent them from enacting their policies.
But
okay, sure. Okay, so the fact that I can vote for something that we all find like fairly morally repugnant, cross your fingers, is not a reason that voting is bad.
That's pretty funny.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
So he's laying the groundwork for some of his upcoming arguments, which is pretty good. He didn't have as much time as I would have liked for like actual questioning, but that's in part because he was trying to pin his opponent down on what are the things I need to show you to demonstrate that it would be morally justifiable to have civil disobedience. I think. I have a sneaking suspicion that what's going to happen is it's going to sound like he meets the criteria that his opponent laid out. The negative will express that no, it is like definitionally impossible, but it's still going to be seen as having met the criteria, and the affirmative will end up being seen as the winner. That's my suspicion, but I'm not exactly sure. We'll find out. Hold on to your seats. And I don't know how there could be this much time left. I assume there's like... Oh, yeah, I don't How is there this much time left? All right. Well, 17 minutes, and we only have what? Oh, I guess we have close to that in speeches. We have 10, 13
In his
minutes of
last
speeches.
speech, the negative tells you that we need to have fair consideration of the.
So this is the 4-minute speech. This is the one where you have to kind of pick up the pace, and you hear him already doing that a little bit. He doesn't speak terribly quickly, anyways, or normally, and so this isn't like that fast. But you notice he has to be quicker, and pinning his opponent down to like these few things, these few criteria, might have also been like, all right, this is now all I have to talk about in my 4 minutes, and I don't really have to address. I don't have to go through the line by line.
The interests of individuals. And then in cross-examination, although it was a little bit hard to hear, we set up 4 planks that I need to meet in order to meet his standard.
Planks.
So the first is that it's non-violent. Remember, that's fine. I tell you, civil disobedience doesn't encompass violence because it's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state.
Again, the like assumption, like the conflation of violence with revolutionary, but it's true. Civil disobedience is in general non-violent. I don't even think that civil disobedience could be considered that if it were violent. I don't think there are violent actions that can be considered as civil disobedience. But remember, his opponent has also conflated violence with breaking the law. So it's a conflict of how we're conflating things, and it's just not going to be addressed, I'm sure.
And since the state is the organism in society that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, civil disobedience precludes any sort of violent action. That's the first plank.
Wait, what? Hold on.
Civil disobedience doesn't encompass violence because it's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state. And since the state is the organism in society that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, civil disobedience precludes any sort of violent action.
Wait, that is the wackiest way of approaching this. Okay, so for those of you who haven't encountered this before, the state is a thing that's often discussed nebulously, but state in like philosophical terms is the governmental body that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. That is the definition. Like anarchists and statists have both talked about this for a long time. That's generally what we mean, and you can see that in the fact that like when there's a protest, they don't say violence started when the police started beating protesters. They say violence started after police started beating protesters because it's the protesters who are capable of doing illegitimate violence where the police are not. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time. Like if the state executes someone, that's not a murder. That is a legitimate use of violence. Or, so many other, like if you're under house arrest, that's not violently kidnapping you. That is house arrest. There's a lot of this stuff built into stuff. And so he's saying, therefore, any encounter with the state that isn't revolutionary must therefore not be violent is not true at all, because like punching a police officer is an encounter with the state that's not revolutionary and is still violent. And it's like, again, like assuming out of the conversation the possibility of being violent in these ways. It's like, oh my god, that's such a weird way of approaching this when you could have just said like civil disobedience is non-violent action. Like like at the very least, in general. I mean, maybe he thinks that there are some instances of civil disobedience that are violent that he has on his mind that he can't get away with. Like, I don't know of them. That's just why I'm struggling a little bit here. And he certainly hasn't brought it up. He's just kind of, so it's like weird that he's assuming it out of the conversation. I want to hear it one more time.
It's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state. And since the state is the organism in society that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, civil disobedience precludes any sort of violent action.
So it precludes that because because they're the only ones who could do legitimate violence. Even it seems to assume like, well, we can't be doing anything illegitimate. That's such a weird and terrible argument. What? That doesn't even make sense.
Plank. The second plank is that it's universal, that everyone should be able to do it. That's fine. I grant that some people might use civil disobedience in ways we don't like. The governor of Alabama might try and stop blacks from entering schools after desegregation orders.
I don't like they keep saying blacks.
I'll grant that. My argument, though, is that society has reciprocal checks to prevent that. So the National Guard gets sent.
Not really, but and also like, was that civil disobedience? Like, I guess he was in violation of the law, huh? Like, I don't know. Yeah, but this is what I mean of like, well, the ends are the problem, or the thing that matters. It's not what you're doing, it's why you're doing it.
Sent in and actually allows those students to go forth. So it's universal, second plank. The third argument is that I still respect authority. Remember, civil disobedience takes place still recognizing the legitimate authority of the state. A civil disobedient is punished. The reason we have laws to say if you break such and such a statute, you will be hit with such and such a penalty. The person who does that through civil disobedience accepts the ability of the law to punish, i.e., they accept the authority of the majority to pass whatever laws they want. Civil disobedience is just another avenue for the minority to amplify their voices and get them into society. So the fourth argument and the fourth plank that I meet is that we're still using democratic processes. Remember, civil disobedience still go through the courts. They still try and persuade the majority. At that point, you're still respecting everyone. So look to his criterion of fair consideration of interests. Fine, it's completely fair. The individual who commits civil disobedience isn't saying that they're any better than anyone else or that the law ought not apply to them. They're just saying that they choose to accept the consequences of breaking a law. Look to the first contention then, where he says that civil disobedience...
So the thing that he hasn't addressed, though, is that his opponent has made pretty clear that it is a violation of people's democratic rights to violate the law. Like, I think you have to address that first. I understand why he wants to start with, hey, if I do this, I win, right? But and you like want to start with those things, but like his opponent's been very clear on that, and none of this works without it. It's almost like obfuscating, just trying to ignore that his opponent has that paradigm, which doesn't make sense, and you could very easily address, but he just doesn't want to talk about it. It seems like.
Asserts the power of one member over society. Remember, that's completely untrue. Civil disobedience is just one part of an integral mechanism between society and the individual. It doesn't say the individual is better than society or outside society's laws. It says that the individual will, for a moral reason, choose to break a law and accept punishment.
Well, you've already acknowledged that this will happen sometimes for immoral reasons, like the governor of Arkansas refusing to acquiesce to refusing to act in accordance with anti-segregation laws. But also the thing that makes it a violation of people's rights, as he said, is that it is a violation of the law we've all agreed to, which has its flaws, but you're not addressing why he said it's
Then he gives you a Singer card saying that everyone should compromise because if everyone was disobedient, there would be chaos. Well, remember, if everyone filed a civil suit in court, then the courts would be clogged and shut down. And if everyone wanted to hold an assembly under their rights guaranteed in the First Amendment, then no one would be available to go to assemblies, and no one would go. So the fact that everyone would do, the fact that if everyone would do something, it would destroy the process, isn't a reason to reject civil disobedience any more than it is a reason to reject civil suits.
That's not the heart of it.
The next argument he gives you is that racists might kick blacks out of a restaurant and they have to force their way back in. Remember, that's completely untrue. The federal government would probably go in and stop those people from...
Why are you accepting the premises of this example? Like, make it clear that's not what happens. I don't know.
From stopping legitimate customers from entering an establishment. So look to the affirmative side of the flow. His argument is that we look to the conscience of democracy, and you have to respect all people. You have obligations to consider others. Completely fine. I admit that in the definition of what civil disobedience means. Then he tells you the individual can be immoral.
But okay. See, again, he skipped over why his opponent said that. His opponent said that because it is his position that violating the law does not consider the views of others because we've all agreed to these laws or whatever. He just doesn't want to talk about it.
Argument is the state can be immoral too, so we should allow the individual moral conscience to act as a check upon society within the limits I prescribe in my definition.
We've made it clear.
His next argument is, again, he repeats the racist argument. Remember, my argument is it's a reciprocal check law fixes. What Rawls then tells you is that in a democracy, the sovereign isn't the final moral authority. This is pretty important. It says that the law doesn't have inherent moral value, so there's no moral obligation to obey it. The second...
So yeah, Rawls said that, but you're not using it in... You're not engaging with what your opponent has said on the subject, which is that because we've all agreed to it, citation needed, it is a violation of our democratic rights to violate laws. So it doesn't, he's not engaging.
Civil disobedience is a check. He tells you laws can stop oppression. I say civil disobedience is another avenue. He says we have to work within the system. That's fine. I'm still accepting the system. Remember, civil disobedience uses the democratic process as a way to effect great change. and then he tells you that we're not looking at motives, that's fine. I'm saying it's always a good thing to be faithful to your own moral conscience within limits. So as long as an individual has fidelity to their own moral compass, that's a moral thing regardless of the motive.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to say. I feel like we've gotten all of it out because a lot of their arguments are just trending on the same lines. The only things that they're really saying that I haven't already addressed have been the really insane stuff, like that bit about encounters with the non-revolutionary encounters with the state can't be violent because the state is the only yeah, or has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. That other than like really insane stuff like that, we've covered most of what they're going to say. I do want to finish things for completion's sake, and I'll be honest, I have been very disappointed with all this, but I'm glad we're watching it, and I hope you found it relevant. I think we have fewer people kicking around in chat than usual, so I'm not exactly sure what y'all are thinking about it, but hopefully you find this at least a little bit valuable. And this does make me a little bit apprehensive to cover more of these kinds of debates in the future. I know people were interested in see what they look like, but this one was really bad, and maybe, well, you guys can let me know if you find value in this.
Let's start with the value and the value criterion. Basically, he doesn't answer the argument where I told you that morality is subjective, which he agrees to in cross-examination. He says that all individuals have different moral beliefs. At that point, everyone has all this moral agency, but the resolution is asking us to morally justify civil disobedience in the context of a democracy where multiple people exist. At that point, if everyone has this equal right to express their moral individual conscience, as he's saying, we can't have this absolute right because it's going to conflict all the time.
You are right now arguing against the concept of protest, because that's the same with everything, or the concept of dissenting ideas. Wow, I did not expect these to go the way that they did.
Therefore, we have to accept restrictions on how we can express our moral beliefs, or else we'd have clash all the time. Essentially, if we want to guarantee some sort of fairness and equality in moral expression of individual conscience for everybody.
So this is a pretty good argument, honestly, that that we have conflicting viewpoints, and we have to accept certain limitations on how we express those viewpoints. The question that we need to answer is where that line should be. That's what this debate is about. Is that line as to what is acceptable? Does that line as to what is acceptable include civil disobedience, or doesn't it? The affirmative seems pretty unwilling to make arguments that it is, rather to just assume that it's okay. And the negative seems unwilling to make arguments that it isn't, so much as to say, well, it's outside of what we've agreed is okay. He wants to, it's closer to a good argument because because the negative has been saying that what we have agreed to by law is our collective agreement as to where the boundaries are of acceptable action, but he's assuming that that is a fair representation of interests, as opposed to demonstrating it. But his opponent also hasn't pushed back on it. As of right now, like, if he can do a couple more things, I think the negative has made his case a lot better. But I also still expect the affirmative to win, just because it's a much harder case to make. But like if he can just highlight that his opponent is not addressing the central and like most important argument that he's made thus far, he could even carry it in. He could just say, like, my opponent has not addressed the idea that a violation of the law is a violation of people's democratic rights. Therefore, he doesn't disagree with it, and all of his arguments fail once you take that into consideration, and negative should win pretty easily.
We have to find some sort of compromise. That's why we look towards the value of justice, giving each their due in terms of moral agency and expression of their moral beliefs, and the value criterion of fair consideration of interests, so we can make sure that everyone gets a fair and equal say in this.
The values and value criterions are so like, I don't know if you noticed, I didn't mention it in the previous speech. They're so nonsensical that I don't even care anymore. Like, I don't even care if they talk. But normally when I haven't mentioned this before, but when you judge a debate round, it is usually good form for the debaters to ask about judging paradigms, and if they don't, for the judge to finger wag at them and then tell them what their judging paradigm is. For me, I'm pretty I'm pretty big on the value criterion debate. I think it's more important than people give it credit for. And even I'm sitting here like, just stop talking about it. Neither of you have cared this whole time. Neither of you made good arguments about it. You don't have any. We don't have any idea of what you mean by these words anyway. And the difference between morality and justice is so esoteric that it doesn't really matter, especially when neither of you are really talking about what they mean. As far as the value criterion goes, I don't care. I just don't care. Neither of you are really impacting well to that. You're basically assuming like you have common ground without them anyway. Just stop talking about it. It's not necessary.
He gives 4 reasons why he does fulfill the fair consideration of interest. The first is that he says it's non-violent, so therefore you're not harming anyone. However, this contradicts his case position, because his case position says to do whatever your conscience tells you. I told you at the end of the last speech. No, it doesn't.
But you had an impact to your arguments that you were violating the democratic rights of others. But okay, sure. Go off,
some
King.
Homicide committers think that their conscience tells them to harm others. At that point, he agrees that the moral obligations you have towards others take precedence over doing what you like. But then he says, we disagree on what these moral obligations are. At that point, the only way you can determine some sort of moral obligation rule for society is to make sure that everyone has a fair say in what moral obligations to others.
So what would make this guy's case a lot easier, but obviously a lot more contentious, is to just be like, fuck it, do what the law says, follow the law. Laws are good, laws are moral, and like it is the only way we have of determining acceptable action. You could make semi-reasonable arguments about this, but I think a lot of people would balk at this, and that's why he doesn't want to say something like that. But ultimately, that's his position, and it works really well here because his opponent does have this like nebulous nature to what he thinks is acceptable and what people's positions are, and their individual conscience and whatever, which he shouldn't have been mentioning in the first place. But it's most people aren't. The problem is you're not going to convince people, even though that's not what this should be about. It should be about the arguments.
People are. That's what happens in democracy. Everyone votes on what's the ground basis for how you can treat other people. You can still express your beliefs through legal channels, but you can't express them however you like. You still have to follow some basic moral obligations in how you treat others.
He says we have basic moral obligations, but what he's referring to is legal channels in the law. He wants to conflate law and morality, which his opponent's first contention sought to address, didn't do it well, but then at the very least was argued against. I don't know. There should have been more discussion on that angle.
That's
if this is
the point of democratic law. It gives you this ground basis, these moral obligations on how you have to treat other people. No one agrees on what those moral obligations are. Therefore, we vote and we come to some sort of compromise so that everyone has
this is where he's
equal moral
assuming that we have a fair.
But then, if he admits that moral obligations to others take precedence over doing what you like, at this point, he already says disobedience is unjustified because it's asserting your moral agency over other people's rights and your moral obligations to other people. That's the first voting issue of the negative side. That in order to
voting issues. Remember, I talked about those on Friday. Just these are the things. This is where I think it proves my point. I think he's correct here. Honestly, I think he did a pretty good job with that argument.
This fair consideration of interest,
even though I disagree with it.
Obligations to others take precedence over your own right to do whatever you think is right. Okay. Now let's go to the second reason why he says he fulfills fair consideration of interest. He says, well, he just has to prove it's universal, and he says society has reciprocal checks. And basically he says, well, you accept punishment. That's his third voting issue, third reason why as well. But basically, I told you in the last speech that just because you accept punishment doesn't mean your act was morally justified. I gave you the example of homicide committers who think they're morally justified.
Well, okay, so this is where somehow, even with signposting, you've lost track of what that was in reference to. This was his, 4 things that you said I need to do to win, and point 3 was respect the authority of the state, more or less. And, he's saying, well, clearly we do, but we're losing track of
killing other people. If he says, well, this is a violent example, I mean, I can give you other examples like thieves who think stuff really belongs to them, so they just go and steal it. And that's not really violent, but it's still harming other people. At this point, even if you accept punishment for your act, it's not going to be morally justified. So all his stuff about accepting punishment...
Yeah, he's just building it this is just kind of a background assumption. If you're violating the law, it is not morally justified, and we're just never going to talk about this. We're just never going to get discussion on that subject.
punishment, which he really seems to rely on throughout his case, doesn't make civil disobedience morally justified. That's the second voting issue of the negative side. Okay. Then his fourth reason why he fulfills fair consideration of interest is because basically we're still having this legitimate democratic process. He says it's one part of the balance between society and the individual. But I already told you in my first voting issue as the negative that your moral obligations are defined by law because that's where everyone gets an equal say to say what these moral obligations are.
Moral obligations are defined by law. Oh my god, do I disagree with this? But yes, he has made that point very clearly, and his opponent just doesn't want to talk about it.
And these moral obligations take precedence over doing what you think is right. So it's not really part of the balance between society and the individual. It's the individual imposing their moral beliefs on everyone else. So then you look to my first contention, where I told you about basically is looking towards asserting your power of one individual over the rest of society. He says, well, it's just part of the balance, and the federal government is going to come in. But basically, what happens
these assumptions that things work out.
You obey some sort of higher moral law.
I'm just trying to get through this. That's why
everyone else has agreed on. You're saying that your moral beliefs matter more than everyone else. At this point, there's no fair consideration of interest because you're not considering other people's moral beliefs. You're only considering your moral beliefs. So he's not achieving morality or justice on any level. That's going to be the third voting issue of the negative. But the fourth voting issue of the negative is going to come from the very bottom of the negative case, where I told you if the minority is justified in breaking the law, the majority is going to justify disobedience right back. That's going to cancel all the institutional checks that already exist in the law and turn conflict resolution into a battle of might is right. He says the federal government is going to come in, but that's a factual statement. We're looking at moral justifications here. And if he morally justifies it for the minority to disobey in order to defend themselves, then he also has to morally justify it for the majority to come right back and repress the minority even more.
What?
Give you an example, like say
what are you talking
the black
about?
people decide to more civilly disobey a law. Basically, they want their equal rights. Then the white people are going to come right back and civilly disobey an equal rights protection law or a due process law to oppress the minority even more. At that point, there's no...
Yeah, so I don't know how to tell you that, yeah, no shit. There's not a system that you're going to devise that's going to exclusively protect good things and exclusively punish bad things. We have to fight for these things. And, yeah, sure. I don't even want to engage with this. It's so dumb. It's just, it's such a weird way of approaching this subject, and I don't think really addresses much of the actual concept at all.
No solving problems at all. Then go back to the affirmative case, where he talks about how the state can be immoral too and individual morality is a check. But the state is the synthesis of individual moralities. It allows everyone an equal chance to express their moral individual beliefs.
Does it, though?
That's why there's a fair consideration of interest on the negative side and none on the affirmative. Finally, he says the sovereign isn't the final moral authority, and we have to be faithful to our own conscience. But he already agreed that moral obligations to others take precedence over following your own conscience. And since the state is the expression of those moral...
That's a little weird to me. Like that. This is what people like think collectivism means, but like no, your conscience generally includes the consideration of others. It's not just like I think I should do this thing. It's not just like the ego. I do whatever the fuck I want and damn the consequences. It's not what that means. But I guess that's how we're acting like it means. I guess your opponent didn't fucking whatever. Didn't like it's a really weird term, and your opponent wasn't exactly clear about what they meant by a lot of this stuff. So whatever.
Considerations to other people, you have to follow them. For these reasons, you vote negative in today's round.
Oh, I'm about done with this, but as of right now, I think the negative has done a much better job arguing their case. I disagree with him vehemently on almost everything he's said the entire time, but I think he's made his case a lot better than the affirmative. Obviously, the affirmative has one more chance to set it right, but even the method, even his approach to how to argue with these things, so far has made it like he finished his last rebuttal with me thinking he hadn't addressed his opponent's points. So I don't have much hope that he's going to turn it around, but we'll give him the opportunity. So this is the speech where he should be slowing it down and just talking about voting issues. My guess is we'll talk mostly about the 4 criteria that he said he has to, like he says the negative agreed would mean he has met his burden, but we'll see.
Okay, I realize that there were more than 2 voting issues given in the negative rebuttal, but I think that all of his arguments basically boil down to two arguments. The first is that we can't do whatever we want because we have some sort of obligation to other people. Granted, I tell you, civil disobedience means respecting that obligation and respecting the inherent individual worth of other people. That's why it's nonviolent.
Well, you say
That's
that,
why
but you
it's a
haven't
way
addressed
of
why he
maneuvering
says it's
between
not
the
the case.
conflicting moralities of the state and the individual. At that point, I'm saying there are limits on civil disobedience, but as long as you don't harm other people, it's still justified. Remember, the law exists to punish people who violate it, and people who violate laws through civil disobedience are punished. So at that point, you are not saying that you can do whatever you want to other people. You're just saying that if you choose to accept individual punishment and not hurt anyone else, it's entirely your decision. The next argument he gives you is that we shouldn't
Yeah, but like you haven't justified why that's okay. You're just saying like, it's your call. You can do it if you want, if you think it's fine. But you haven't morally justified it. Ugh,
our beliefs on other people, or say
it's
that they're
better
more
than this.
important.
Competitive debate
Remember what I
is
tell you, that doesn't happen
usually
either.
better,
Civil
or at least it
disobedience
can be
is
better than
universally justified no matter what your belief is. Just as I am universally justified in using my right to free speech to talk about whatever I want as long as it doesn't incite violence. So what
That's
that
not
means
true
then
either.
is that even if we disagree with other people, it's not saying that our rights are more, or our morals are more important than theirs. It's saying that we choose to use this avenue as a way to promote discussion. Remember that I'm telling you, we use the democratic process when you're civilly disobedient.
Oh, and just to clarify, because like I guess I should say something, but you're saying like you justified using my rights to free speech, like it's morally justified to use my speech as long as I'm not threatening violence. That's not true at all. It's definitely immoral to harass people or to threaten people. There's a lot of those things happen to also be illegal, but there are some things that are not illegal that you would consider kind of immoral. Like Holocaust denial is pretty immoral, even if it's not illegal to do. But there are ways that you can use your right to free speech in legal ways that are not justified, even if you think, it's just not true at all what he was saying.
That as soon
But this is also the first time he's mentioned it, and it's in the last speech where his opponent will have zero opportunity to refer to that example. This isn't technically a new argument because it's it's a counter argument to something he talked about before, but this is a little sleazy in the sense of like your opponent had no opportunity to talk about this specific counter example.
as you disobey a law, it enters into the courts, or you try and generate public opinion to pass new legislation. So you're still respecting society's beliefs. My argument is that since morality differs from individual to individual, as long as the individual stays within the prescribed limits I give you and respects the individual agency of others...
This is some, like, again, like pseudo-legalism. It's not quite legalism in the way his opponent is saying, where, like, if you're violating the law, it's inherently bad. But it's basically just, like, you can violate... It's basically acceptable violations of the law, in a way saying the law should allow these acts in addition to the ones already accepted as methods of protest. In that way, is kind of like it's a legalism with a proposed change to the current law. I really don't like the kind of assumption of legal authority here.
Other actors by not using violence, by not
either
destroying property, by accepting the punishment laid down by the majority.
Not destroying property. Civil disobedience sometimes includes destruction of property, but you're like assuming all the bad things out of it. Yes, if civil disobedience is exclusively like doing a sit-in, then yes, it will, like, it's usually okay. But obviously, it's more than that, and your opponent is made clear why he is opposed to even that. Why he would call that violating democratic rights of others.
Majority, it's entirely good that they follow their own moral conscience. Remember, they might go to jail or they might be fined, but if they believe they're doing the moral thing, that's fine, and it's not our decision to make to tell them they ought not do it.
I mean,
additionally, remember what John Rawls tells you, that in a democracy...
Now he's even saying, like, it's not our place to say that civil disobedience is wrong. What then it literally can't be wrong from what you're saying? This is insane to me.
Democracy, the sovereign isn't the final moral authority as would exist in an authoritarian government or a monarchy. So that means there's no moral obligation to obey the law, which isn't moral in any...
You think there would be a moral obligation to obey the law in a dictatorship or a theocracy? It's like actively fighting against getting into the philosophical arguments.
Instance, he tells you that the law can be immoral, but I'm saying that because there's no fundamental moral quality to the law, there doesn't exist a moral obligation. then the only other argument he's really got
But
going for him
he
is
has, by the way, made clear why there is a moral qualia to the law, because it is because we have these rights that we use as a method of compromise. It doesn't make any sense, but you haven't even talked about it, let alone proved it wrong.
that the majority then can oppress the minority. But my argument is that civil disobedience is only one of several different checks in society, and that if the majority tries to oppress the minority, like the governor of Alabama did, then the societal legal
now we're just
system
hand
will
waving.
step
Like
in
the
and
bad
stop
things
them
won't
from
happen.
doing that.
There are
So at
there are
that
things that'll
point,
stop the bad
there
things
is
from
no
happening.
violence, there's no
In which case, why is there
infringement of
civil
other people's
disobedience?
rights.
Why do we
All
need
I'm
it?
allowing people to do is remain faithful to their own moral conscience. That's always morally justified, as long as you don't cause
But you've
harm to other
admitted that it's not. Oh, as long as you don't cause problems. Well, that's the whole thing. That's the whole discussion, is whether this is causing problems.
people. So that's
Why
the
are they
reason, then,
so
that you
unwilling
affirm
to
the
talk
resolution.
about the subject? Okay, so that's where that's where the actual debate ends. Part of the reason I was talking about things the way I was is because I couldn't help but look at the description where it says who the winner is. Now I didn't hear their names be given here, but I can make a guess that the guy from Minnesota named Jed Glickstein is the affirmative here, and I think he won despite the fact that um uh what the hell? Why are there key moments from the Sarah Zed video in this video description? What the hell? But my guess is the affirmative is this Jed Glickstein, who I think did not win this debate, even though I agree generally with the affirmative position on this subject. Uh, yeah, he won it a 10-1. I think that's a lot to do with like, I don't know. It feels a lot like the judges are just unwilling, or just like, well, they think that civil disobedience is okay, and as much as they might pretend like they're neutral judges, they're not getting away from that, because it seems really clear that the negative argued their case better. They had a contingency, that had a fundamental part of their case that disproved basically everything the affirmative said that went unaddressed, and it's just yeah, let's some of these comments. Uh Okay, not really interesting stuff in here. But yeah, okay. It could be built a lot better than this. I feel like this is a bad example. Maybe we'll come back to competitive debate with this, with something more recent. Maybe it's improved since, but this is really discouraging for doing more competitive debate content. Let me know in the comments, since people aren't chatting that much, what you think about this kind of discussion. I am a lot more I'm I'm a lot more disappointed. I'm a lot more jaded now than before we got into this. I know it could also was probably like pretty boring, but I know people wanted to see what it can look like. This is, I would argue, a very bad debate, but still like pretty close in form. There was a lot of stuff that was a little weird to me. Normally there was a lot more structure from what I remember, but maybe this is like different schools of thought about how to do this. You know, I'm in one part of the country, they're in different parts of the country. Um, but yeah, so I guess we did the thing where we went over the stuff. I haven't mentioned this yet, but it would be a huge help for my channel generally if you know, like, comment, subscribe. I don't like doing the shilling thing, but I would very much appreciate it. And I got to do it sometimes. Got to remind everyone, if you like what I do here, or some of the stuff that I've started to do, or maybe I haven't done yet, but you think I could, yada, etc. Yeah, hit me up with some comments. Let me know what you think I'm doing right, what you think I'm doing wrong. Uh, and I'll see you. I'll see you in the future. This was ultimately pretty disappointing, all told, but I'm glad I got to wet my beak with some more debate after all these years. So tomorrow I was thinking like, well, maybe that's what we'll do this week, but given how this went, I don't think I want to come back to another one, at least for a couple of days. So maybe we'll do like a Prager day tomorrow or something. Just get that worked in. We'll figure it out as we go, I suppose. So thank all for watching. Like I said, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Please and thank you, and I'll catch you next time. Have a good one.